Welcome to an adventure that will lull you to sleep while educating you about one of the most horrific and interesting periods in history. Conflicts. As your awareness wanes and your thoughts turn to sleep, allow the Crusades narrative unfolds, like a calm wave guiding you through centuries of human conflict, faith, and ambition. You're standing in a busy field in the year 1095. France's Clermont. Your flesh stings from the November air as thousands of people line up to hear Pope Urban to give what will turn out to be one of the most important speeches in history. Like thunder sweeping over far-off hills, his voice echoes throughout the assemblage. Dio's vault. The crowd begins to chant, "God wills it." Millions will be motivated to march and take up the cross by these two words, which will reverberate across 2 centuries of conflict in the direction of the Holy Land. However, prior to that crucial moment, allow us, we examine the circumstances behind this remarkable call to arms. Take a deep breath and relax your muscles. Imagine the 11th century world, when maps were mysterious, and the majority of people never left their birthplace more than a day's walk away. The forces that looked intent on engulfing the Christian world made it feel small and beleaguered. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, that last flickering remnant of Rome's ancient glory, struggled desperately to survive. Emperor Alexios Komnenos ruled from Constantinople, a city that straddled 2 continents and 2 worlds. His empire had once stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, but now Turkish armies pressed ever closer to his capital. The Seljuk Turks, these fierce nomadic warriors, hard swept out of Central Asia, had already conquered much of Anatolia, Thempia's heartland. Let your mind drift back to that terrible day in 1071, when everything changed at a place called Manicut. Emperor Romanos IV had led his army into the Armenian highlands, confident in his ability to push back these Turkish raiders. But confidence meant nothing when faced with the tactical genius of Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle that followed became a catastrophe beyond imagination. For the first time in 7 centuries, a Roman emperor fell captive to an enemy. As you sink deeper into relaxation, imagine the horror that rippled through the Christian world when news of this defeat spread. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a sign that perhaps God himself had turned his face away from his chosen people. The Turks didn't stop at Manzikert. They poured into Anatolia like water through a broken dam, establishing themselves in cities that had been Christian for 1,000 years. Nika, where the Great Council had once defined Christian doctrine, became the capital of a Turkish sultanate. Antioch, where the followers of Christ had first been called Christians, fell under Muslim rule. Jerusalem itself, though still technically controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, seemed more distant than ever from Christian pilgrims. As your breathing becomes deeper and more rhythmic, transport yourself to Onof, those pilgrim journeys. You're walking the dusty roads that lead to Jerusalem, part of a small group of believers who have sold everything they owned to make this sacred journey. The road is dangerous, filled with bandits and suspicious local authorities. Each night, you huddle around a small fire, sharing bread and wine while singing hymns under the star-filled sky. When you finally reach Jerusalem, when you finally touch the stones where Christ walked, the joy is indescribable. But that joy is tinged with sadness, because you know how precarious Christian access to these holy places become. Back in Western Europe, the Church was experiencing its own transformation. The Gregorian Reform movement was reshaping Christianity, emphasizing the authority of the Pope and the spiritual purity of the clergy. Monasticism was flourishing with new orders, like the Cistercians, attracting thousands of men and women seeking a life of prayer and contemplation. But alongside this spiritual renewal came a growing militarization of Christian society. The Peace of God movement tried to limit warfare between Christians, but it also began to redirect that warrior energy toward external enemies. The concept of holy war was not new to Christianity, but it was evolving in fascinating ways. St. Augustine had written about just war centuries earlier, but now theologians were developing ideas about wars that weren't just permissible, but actual. Fighting for Christ could become a form of penance, a way to earn forgiveness for sins while serving God's purposes on earth. Knights who had spent their lives fighting each other over petty territorial disputes could now fight for something transcendent. Pope Urban understood all of these currents when he rose to speak at Clermont. He had received that desperate letter from Emperor Alexio begging for military assistance against the Turks. The Pope saw an opportunity that went far beyond helping Byzantium. He could unite the fractious nobility of Western Europe under a single banner. He could assert papal authority over the entire Christian world. Most importantly, he could reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Listen to his words as they echo across the centuries. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people sewed crosses onto their clothing, symbolically taking the vow to march to Jerusalem. The word crusade itself comes from the Latin crusata, meaning marked with the cross. These weren't just soldiers responding to the call. Entire families prepared to leave everything behind. Nobles mortgaged their lands to fund the expedition. Peasants sold their tools and livestock. Even women and children joined the movement. Despite the obvious dangers, a sleep gently embraces you. Imagine the chaos and excitement of those first preparations. Picture Godfrey of Boulogne, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, selling his castle to fund his participation. Envision Raymond of Toulouse, already in his 60s, liquidating his vast holdings to lead the largest contingent. These weren't poor men seeking fortune. They were some of the wealthiest nobles in Europe, willing to risk everything for the promise of eternal salvation. But the organized nobility weren't the first to depart. In the spring of 1096, a charismatic known as Peter the Hermit began leading what historians call Theopul's Crusade. Peter was a small, weathered man who rode a donkey and claimed to have received a vision from Christ himself, commanding him to liberate Jerusalem. His preaching attracted thousands of poor people, minor knights, and social outcasts who couldn't wait for the official expedition. The People's Crusade became a tragedy of epic proportions. These untrained, poorly equipped masses moved through Germany and Hungary like a plague of locusts, begging and stealing food as they went. When they reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This wasn't the disciplined assistance he had requested. Against his advice, Peter's followers crossed into Anatolia, where the Turkish Sultan Kilig Alan was waiting. The massacre that followed was complete. Thousands died, and the few survivors limped back to Constantinople, their dreams of glory shattered. Even worse was the fate of other popular movements that never made it out of Europe. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind recoil from the horror of what happened in the Rhineland. Groups of crusaders, inflamed by religious zealotry and economic resentment, turned their fury against the Jewish communities of Germany. In cities like Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, entire Jewish quarters were destroyed. Thousands of innocent people died simply because they practiced a different faith. This dark side of the crusading movement, this transformation of religious enthusiasm into ethnic hatred, will stain the entire enterprise. But while these tragic preliminaries were unfolding, the main crusading armies were still preparing. These were serious military forces led by experienced Edmonds. Godfrey of Bouillon gathered knights from the Holy Roman Empire. Beaumont, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, brought his experienced elders, who had been fighting Muslims in Sicily. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, led French nobility. Raymond of Toulouse commanded the largest army drawn from southern France, and including many veterans of the Spanish Reconquista. The logistics of moving these armies were staggering. Tens of thousands of people needed to be fed, armed, and transported across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Horses required fodder, soldiers needed weapons, and everyone required food and water. The Crusaders developed supply chains that stretched across Europe, with Italian merchants providing ships and Greek officials organizing provisioning. It was perhaps the largest coordinated military effort Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. As winter turns to spring in your dreams, watch these great armies finally begin their march. The route to Constantinople became a river of humanity flowing eastward. Knights and glittering mail rode alongside their squires and servants. Priests carried relics and sang hymns. Engineers brought siege equipment broken down for transport. Camp followers, including many women and children, provided essential services like cooking, nursing, and maintenance equipment. The journey to Constantinople took months, and it tested the Crusaders in ways they hadn't anticipated. Supply problems led to conflicts with local populations. Different national groups within the Crusade began to develop suspicions about each other's motives. The Byzantine officials they encountered seemed more interested in extracting oaths of loyalty than in facilitating their passage. By the time these armies reached Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, their initial enthusiasm had been tempered by harsh realities. Emperor Alexios found himself in an impossible position. He had asked for military assistance, but what arrived at these gates were armies larger than his own, led by ambitious nobles who clearly had their own agendas. The negotiations that followed were delicate and complex. Alexios wanted the Crusaders to swear oaths, promising to return any former Byzantine territories they conquered. The Crusader leaders were willing to make such promises, but they interpreted them very differently than the emperor intended. Let your sleeping mind witness the spectacular ceremonies in the great palace of Constantinople. Imagine these Western knights, many of had never seen a city larger than a few thousand people, suddenly confronted with a metropolis of 500,000 in. The wealth and sophistication of Byzantine civilization overwhelmed them. The Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome that seemed to float in the air, made their own cathedrals look like villager churches. The emperor himself, dressed in silk and purple, surrounded by an elaborate courtiole, seemed like a figure from another world. But beneath the diplomatic niceties, tensions were already emerging that would shape the entire future of the Crusades. The Byzantines were primarily interested in recovering their lost territories in Anatolia. The Western Crusaders were focused on reaching Jerusalem. These different objectives would eventually lead to bitter conflicts, but for now, both sides needed each other. In the spring of 1097, the great adventure truly began as the Crusader armies crossed from Europe into Asia. Their first target was Nika, the Turkish capital that controlled the main route into Anatolia. The siege that followed revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the crusading movement. The Western knights were brave and well equipped. but they had little experience with siege warfare in this climate. The Turks were skilled defenders who understood the terrain and could call on reinforcements. The siege of Nika lasted for weeks under the scorching Anatolian sun. As Yausleep imagined the sounds of this medieval siege, the thunderous crash of catapults hurling stones against the walls, the whistle of arrows filling the air, the shouts of men fighting hand-to-hand combat on scaling ladders. The Crusaders surrounded the city on 3 sides, but Nika sat beside a large lake, and Turkish boats continued to bring supplies and reinforcements. The breakthrough came when the Byzantine managed to transport ships overland Tuth Lake, cutting off the city's waterborne supply line. Faced with inevitable defeat, the Turkish garrison negotiated a surrender with Emperor Alexios rather than with the Crusaders. Thus this caused the first serious rift in the alliance. The Western Knights had expected to sack the city and claim booty to fund their expedition. Instead, they found Byzantine banners flying from the walls and their supposed allies controlling access to the city. Despotethes tensions. The capture of Nika was a crucial victory. It opened the road to Jerusalem and demonstrated that the Turkish armies, formidable as they were, could be defeated. The Crusaders had faced their first major test and passed it, even if the victory left some bitter feelings about Byzantine intentions. As your breathing becomes slow and regular, follow the Crusader armies as they push deeper into Anatolia. The landscape they traversed was beautiful but treacherous. Rolling hills covered with scrub vegetation, river valleys that promised water but often proved to be dry, mountain passes where our small force could hold up an entire army. The heat was crushing for men accustomed to the cooler climates of Europe, and their heavy armor became almost unbearable under the blazing sun. The Turks under Sultan Kilij Alan were far from finished. They had learned from their defeat at Nika and were preparing a new strategy. Rather than defending fixed positions, they would use their superior mobility to harass the Crusaders, striking when Christians were most vulnerable and disappearing. Before they could respond effectively, Turkish mounted archers could fire arrows while riding at full gallop, a skillful European knights found both impressive and terrifying. The great test came at a place, Caledrum, on July 1st, 1097. The Crusader army had divided into 2 groups for easier marching, and the Turks saw their opportunity. At dawn, thousands of Turkish cavalry swept down on the advance guard led by Beaumont. The attack was so sudden and fierce that it seemed the entire crusading movement might end before it had truly begun. Listen to the thunder of hoofbeat as wave after wave of Turkish horsemen charged the Crusader lines. Watch the arrows darken the sky like clouds of locusts. Feel the panic that rippled through the Christian ranks as their horses went down and their formation began to break apart. For hours, it seemed certain that Thismal force would be annihilated far from home. Their dreams of Jerusalem dying in the dust of an Anatolian battlefield. But the Crusaders held Bohemond and organized his knights into a defensive circle, using their superior armor and discipline to withstand the Turkish assault. The archers and infantry, including Manuan combatants, fought with desperate courage. Women and children helped carry water to Thrunded and arrows to the defenders. Priests moved through the ranks, offering absolution and encouragement. The battle turned when the Second Cruiser Army, led by Godfrey and Raymond, arrived on the battlefield. The Turks, committed to their attack on Beaumont's force, found themselves caught between 2 enemies. The fresh Crusader cavalry charged into their flank, and the Turkish army, which had seemed on the verge of victory, suddenly collapsed. Sultan Kilij Alan's camp was captured, along with vast amounts of treasure that would help fund the rest of the expedition. Durham was more than just a victory. It was a revelation. The Crusaders had proven they could defeat the Turks in open battle. More importantly, they had learned to fight as a unified force despite their different nationalities and personal rivalries. The success gave them confidence for the challenges ahead and convinced many wavering supporters back in Europe that God truly was blessing their enterprise. As you sink deeper into peaceful sleep, let your mind wander through the months that followed. The Crusader armies pushed through central Anatolia, reclaiming city after city for Bizan. To the local Christian populations, many of whom had lived under Muslim rule for decades, greeted the Crusaders as spectators. Ancient churches were reconsecrated, and the sound of church bells rang again in communities that had been silent for a generation. But the march was taking its toll. The summer heat was merciless, and water was often scarce. Horses died by the thousands, forcing knights to fight foot. Disease spread through the camps, claiming lives that Turkish swords had not been able to take. The Crusaders were learning that their greatest enemy might not be human opposition, but the harsh realities of campaigning in an alien environment. The first major division in the Crusader ranks occurred when Baldwin, Godfrey's brother, broke away from the main army with a small force. Baldwin was ambitious and pragmatic, and saw opportunities in the political chaos of the region that were too good to pass up. He marched eastward into Mesopotamia, where he would eventually establish the First Crusader state in the county of Edessa. His success demonstrated that the Crusades were already becoming something more complex than a simple religious pilgrimage. Meanwhile, the main army approached its next great challenge, the ancient city of Antioch. As autumn turned to winter in your dreams, picture this magnificent city that had once been one of the greatest metropolises of the Roman Empire. Antioch sat astride the trade routes between Europe and Asia, protected by massive walls that stretched for miles around the city and up the steep slopes of Mount Silius. It was here that the followers of Christ had first been called Christians, making Gates' recapture symbolically crucial for the crusading movement. The siege of Antioch would become the defining experience of the First Crusade, a test that pushed the Crusaders to the very limits of their endurance. The city was too large to surround completely, and the Turkish garrison was well supplied and confident. Winter in northern Syria was cold and wet, a miserable contrast to the dry heat the Crusaders had endured in Anatolia. Food became scarce. Then, many Crusaders began to question whether they would ever see Jerusalem. Let the months of siege warfare wash over your sleeping consciousness like waves against a shore. Picture the daily routine of men slowly starving while maintaining a military effort that seemed increasingly hopeless. Watch the deserters slip away in the night, including some prominent nobles who had sworn sacred oaths to continue the journey. Feel the growing desperation as news arrived that a massive Turkish relief army was marching to break the siege. The breakthrough came through treachery rather than military prowess. A Turkish tower guard named Firuz, possibly motivated by money or personal grievances, agreed to let the Crusaders into the city. On the night of June 3, 1098, Beaumont led a small force up the walls and opened the gates. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, and after months of siege, the city fell in a single night. But victory turned autocracy almost immediately. The Turkish relief army arrived just days after the city's capture. And now it was the Crusaders who found themselves besieged. They had captured Antioch, only to become trapped inside its walls, with their enemies controlling the surrounding countryside. Food was even scarcer than it had been during the siege, and morale plummeted to new depths. It was at this darkest moment that the Crusaders experienced what they believed be divine intervention. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions of St. Andrew, who told him that the lance that had pierced Christ's side was buried in Antioch's cathedral. Whether through genuine faith or desperate hope, the Crusaders cathedral floor and found what they proclaimed to be the Holy Lance. The psychological effect was electric. Men who had been on the verge of surrender suddenly found new strength. The discovery of the relic seemed to confirm that God had not abandoned them, that their suffering had a purpose. When they finally marched out to face the Turkish army, they fought with a ferocity that surprised their inimicent themselves. The Battle of Antioch was a complete victory for the Crusaders. The Turkish relief army, which had seemed so formidable, scattered before the Christian charge. The regional Turkish alliance that had threatened to destroy the crusading movement collapsed in a single day. The road to Jerusalem was open once again. But the victory at Antioch also created new problems. Bourne claimed the city as his own despite his oath to return Byzantine territories to Emperor Alexei. This decision established the Principality of Antioch, the second Crusader state, but it also marked the definitive break between the Crusaders and Bondim. The alliance that had made the expedition possible was dissolving, just as success seemed within reach. As winter deepens in your dreams, watch the Crusader armies slowly reorganize for the final push toward Jerusalem. Many Crusaders considered their vows fulfilled with the capture of Antioch and returned home. Others were so weakened by disease and malnutrition that they could not continue. The force that eventually marched south toward Palestine was smaller than what had left Europe, but it was also more experienced and determined. The journey through Syria and Palestine revealed the complex political situation thought the Crusaders were entering. The Muslim world was deeply divided between the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and various Turkish emirates that owed nominal allegiance to one or the other. These divisions had allowed the Crusaders to succeed where a united Muslim response might have stopped them. But they also meant that any Crusader settlements would face constant pressure from multiple directions. Some Muslim leaders even allied with the Crusaders against their own religious rivals. The Fatimids, who controlled Jerusalem, had been fighting the Turks for initially saw the Crusaders as potential allies against their Sunni enemies. This fragmentation of the Muslim response was crucial to Crusader success. But it also meant that their political situation remained fluid and dangerous. As your sleeping mind drifts through the Palestinian countryside, imagine the excitement that built as the Crusaders approached their ultimate destination. Jerusalem was more than just a city to these medieval Christians. It was the center of the world, the place where Christ had died and risen again. Many Crusaders had joined the expeditions specifically to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, and some expected the second coming to occur once the city was back in Christian hands. On June 7, 1099, nearly 3 years after Pope Urban's call at Clermont, the Crusader armies finally came within sight of Jerusalem. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Men who had endured incredible hardships, who had watched friends die of disease and battle wounds, who had questioned their faith and their mission, suddenly found themselves looking at the golden dome of the rock and the walls of the holy city. Many Crusaders fell to their knees and wept. Others began singing hymns of thanksgiving. The moment seemed to justify everything they had suffered, every sacrifice they had made. But the city still had to be taken, and the Fatimid garrison was well prepared for a siege. Jerusalem, in 1099, was a formidable fortress. Its walls had been recently repaired and strengthened. The garrison was professional and motivated. Most importantly, for the besiegers, the city's cisterns were full of water, while the surrounding countryside afforded few reliable sources. The Crusaders found themselves in a race against time. They had to take the city before the Egyptian relief army arrived, or their own supplies ran out. The siege lasted just over a month, but it tested the Crusaders' engineering skills and determination. They had learned siege warfare during their long campaigns, and they applied those lessons with desperate efficiency. Wooden siege towers were constructed from timber brought from distant forests, catapultural stones against the walls day and night. Miners worked to undermine the fortifications, while defenders poured boiling oil and Greek fire on the attackers. Let your sleeping consciousness witness the final assault on July 15, 1099. Picture the massive siege towers rolling forward on their wooden wheels, their upper levels crowded with knights and crossbowmen. Watch Godfrey of Bouillon himself leap from a siege tower onto the city walls, his sword cutting through the desperate defenders. Feel the earth shake as sections of the wall collapsed under the constant bombardment. When the walls were finally breached, the Crusaders poured into Jerusalem like a flood. What followed was one of the most controversial episodes in the entire history of the Crusades. For 3 days, Christian soldiers killed Muslims and Jews throughout the city. Contemporary accounts, probably exaggerated but still horrifying, describe blood flowing in the streets and piles of severed heads and hands. The massacre at Jerusalem was not unique in medieval warfare, but its scale and religious context made it particularly shocking. The Crusaders seemed to believe that they were carrying out divine justice, cleansing the holy city of those they saw as defilers to modern sensibilities. Their actions seem monstrous, but they must be understood within the context of 11th century religious thought and military practice. When the killing finally ended, the Crusaders faced the question of what to do with their conquest. Most of the expedition survivors considered their vows fulfilled and prepared to return home. But someone had to govern the territories they had conquered. And that someone turned out to be Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, claiming that he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem completed the creation of the Crusader states that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. These 4 political entities, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, represented something unprecedented in medieval history. Western European feudalism transplanted to the Middle East. As your breathing becomes deeper and more peaceful, let your mind explore these remarkable political creations. The Crusader states were never more than narrow strips of territory along the coast and in the river valleys, islands of Latin Christianity in a sea of Islam. Their survival depended on constant vigilance, military innovation, and careful diplomacy with their Muslim neighbors. The Crusaders who remained in the East became a new type of European, the Pooler or Pulley men who adapted to local conditions while maintaining their Western identity. They learned Arabic, adopted local architectural styles, and developed trading relationships with Muslim merchants. Some even formed military alliances with Muslim rulers against other Crusader lords. The rigid religious boundaries that had motivated the First Crusade began to blur in the practical realities of governing a diverse population. The military orders represented the most distinctive institutional development of the Crusader states. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. evolved into an international organization with thousands of members and vast financial resources. The Knights Hospitaller, originally established to care for sick pilgrims, became equally militarized. These orders combined the religious devotion of monasticism with the martial skills of knighthood, creating something entirely new in Christianity. As sleep deepens around you like a gentle embrace, imagine these warrior monks in their distinctive white robes, marked with red crosses. The Templars developed Internet, Europe's first international banking system, using their network of command to transfer money safely across vast distances. Pilgrims could deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, revolutionizing medieval finance. Their disciplined military formations became legendary, with rules that forbade retreat, unless outnumbered more than 3-1. The success of the First Crusade sent shockwaves throughout both the Christian and Muslim worlds. In Europe, the victory was seen as divine vindication of the crusading ideal. Chronicles described miraculous intervention, angelic armies fighting alongside the Crusaders, and saints appearing to guide the faithful. The Pope proclaimed special indulgence for future expeditions, and recruitment for ongoing campaigns became a permanent feature of European religious life. But in the Muslim world, the Crusader conquest sparked a different kind of awakening. The initial response had been fragmented and ineffective, hampered by political divisions and mutual suspicions. However, the shock of losing Jerusalem gradually galvanized Islamic resistance. Religious scholars began preaching jihad with new urgency, calling for unity against the foreign invaders who had seized Islam's third holiest city. The first serious Muslim counterattack came from an unexpected direction. Ilghazi, the Turkmen ruler of Mardin, allied with other regional powers, Torkalenj, the most exposed of the Crusader states. In 1119, at a place called the Field of Blood, his forces virtually annihilated the army of Antioch. Prince Roger was killed, along with Mostof, his knights, and for a moment it seemed the principality might fall entirely. But the Crusader states demonstrated a remarkable resilience. Reinforcements arrived from Jerusalem and from Europe. New military tactics were developed, and the political structure proved flexible enough to serve even catastrophic defeats. The Field of Blood became a learning experience rather than a death blow, teaching the Crusaders that their survival depended on avoiding pitched battles unless absolutely necessary. Let your sleeping mind drift through the 1120s and 1130s. A period when the Crusader states seemed to stabilize and even prosper. Trade flourished between East and West with Italian merchants, establishing permanent communities in Acre Tiando, the coastal cities. The agricultural productivity of the region recovered from the disruptions of conquest, and the Crusader nobility began to see themselves as permanent residents rather than temporary occupiers. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem emerged as most successful of the second-generation Crusader rulers. Unlike his predecessors, who had been shaped by the brutal experiences of the First Crusade, Baldwin understood that long-term survival required more than military prowess. He cultivated relationships with local Christian communities, including Armenians, Maronites, and Orthodox Greeks, who had lived in the region for centuries. Baldwin also recognized that the Crusader states could not survive in isolation. He negotiated carefully with the Byzantine Empire, seeking to repair the damage done by earlier Crusader betrayals. He maintained correspondence with European rulers, ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies. Most importantly, he began to exploit divisions within the Muslim world, playing different factions against each other to prevent the emergence of bona fide opposition. the second generation of Crusaders developed a distinctive culture that blended Western and Eastern elements. Crusader castles combined European military architecture with local building techniques, creating fortifications like Crusades that virtually impregnable. Illuminated manuscripts from Crusader scriptums show artistic influences from Byzantine, Islamic, and Western traditions. Even Crusader law codes incorporated elements of local legal traditions alongside European feudal customs. But this period of relative stability was built on foundations that were inherently unstable. The Crusader states remained demographically tiny, with perhaps 120,000 Latin Christians ruling over a population that was predominantly Muslim, with substantial Orthodox Christian and Jewish minorities. Every military defeat potentially spelled doom, because there was no larger population base from which to recruit replacements. More ominously, the Muslim world was beginning to produce leaders who combined political skill with genuine religious commitment to reconquest. Zangi, the Turkish governor of Mosul, spent the 1130s gradually building a coalition of Muslim powers, united around the goal of jihad against the Crusaders. Unlike earlier Muslim leaders who had been content with raiding and tribute, Zangi aimed for nothing less than the complete expulsion of the Frankish presence. His opportunity came in 1144, when internal disputes weakened the county of Edessa, the most exposed of the Crusader states. Either dust of broken truces settles like ash across wine-dark plain as we enter the second phase of this ancient tale. The stage has been set with divine wrath and mortal pride. But now deeper currents stir beneath the surface of war. Where once we witnessed the fury of individual heroes clashing like bronze titans, we shall now observe how the very foundations of loyalty and honor begin to crack under the weight of prolonged conflict. The son of Pelles remains apart from battle, his terrible anger burning like an eternal flame beside his black ships. Yet his absence creates a vacuum that draws other forces into motion. Force that will test the bonds between men and gods, between duty and desire, between the living and the dead. For 9 years, this siege has consumed the flower of woe civilizations. And now, the accumulated weight of sorrow begins to work changes in even the mightiest hearts. Watch as Apollo, the far shooter, tends faithful servants, while Athena sharpens her strategies for the battles to come. Observe how mortal warriors tested beyond endurance discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. See how the women of Troy, from royal Andromache to the humblest servant, bear burdens that would break lesser spirits. This is not merely the continuation of a war, but the deepening of it. The moment when conflict transforms from adventure into tragedy. When heroes begin to understand the true cost of the glory they have sought. The Trojan prince Hector stands upon his city's walls, gazing across the corpse-strewn battlefield toward the distant Argive camp. 9 years of warfare have aged him beyond his mortal span, etching lines of care around eyes that once sparkled with a fearful confidence. The bronze spear in his hand, polished smooth by countless battles, catches the morning light as he surveys the eternal stalemate that has become his life. Below, in Troy's winding streets, the sounds of a city under siege create their own rhythm. Blacksmiths hammer bronze into weapons and armor, their forges burning day and night. Women weave at their looms, creating their cloth that will either dress warriors for battle or shroud them for burial. Children play games of war in the dusty courtyards, mimicking the heroes whose deeds they hear sung in the great hall, not yet understanding that those same heroes may soon lie cold beneath the earth. The great gates of Troy stand closed against the morning, their bronze fittings gleaming like captured starlet. Guards pace the battlements, their eyes scanning the plain for signs of enemy movement, but today brings no immediate threat of assault, only the grinding tension of siege warfare, where victory belongs not to the swift or the brave, but to those who can endure longest the slow corruption of hope. In the palace, King Priam sits upon his ivory throne, receiving reports from his commanders with the weary patience of a man who has heard too much of death. His white hair, once the crown of dignity, now seems a mark of premature aging, brought on by the weight of his people's suffering. Beside him, Queen Hecuba maintains the appearance of royal composure, but her hands tremble slightly as she spins thread that will become thread, that will become cloth, that will perhaps become shrouds for her sons. The royal council chamber echoes with familiar arguments about strategy and resources. How long can the city's granaries sustain the population? When will reinforcements arrive from distant allies? Can the walls withstand another determined assault? These questions have been asked and answered 1,000 times. Yet they must be asked again, for the alternative is to surrender to despair. Hector's younger brother, Paris, the shepherd prince whose beauty began this war, sits silent in the council. The golden armor he wears cannot disguise the haunted look in his dark eyes, the expression of a man who knows that thousands have died for his sake. Helen, the daughter of Zeus, whose face launched 1,000 ships, rarely appears in public now, keeping to her chambers, where she weaves scenes of the very war that was fought to reclaim her. Her beauty remains but it has become a terrible burden, a reminder of the price that beauty can exact when it becomes the object of mortal desire. Yet Troy endures, as it has endured for 9 long years. The city's walls, built by the gods themselves in ages past, remain unreached. The people continue their daily labors, finding in routine a kind of resistance to the chaos that surrounds them. The temples still echo with prayers and sacrifices as priests besiege the immortals for protection and victory. Life, stubborn and resilient, continues even in the shadow of war. Bouton this morning, as Hector surveys the battlefield, he senses something different in the air. The quality of light seems changed, as if the sun itself shines with different intentions. The wind carries new scents across the plain, bringing with it the promise of events that will reshape the war. For though the son of Peleus remains apart from battle, his wrath has set in motion consequences that extend far beyond his personal grievance against Agamemnon. In the Archive camp, those consequences are beginning to manifest in ways both subtle and profound. The absence of their greatest champion has forced the other heroes to confront their own limitations and mortality. Ajax, the great tower of Archive strength, finds himself bearing responsibility, once shared between many. Diomedes, blessed by Athena with temporary divine power, has tasted what it means to fight like a god among mortals. Only to discover that such gifts come with their own burdens. The common soldiers, whose names will never be sung by poets, but whose spears and shields form the backbone of every army, go about their duties with the grim professionalism of men who have seen too much death to harbor illusions about glory. They sharpen their weapons, tend their gear, and share what little food remains from dwindling supplies, all while casting nervous glances toward the black ships, where their greatest protector broods in magnificent isolation. Agamemnon himself, king of kings and leader of the great expedition, struggles with problems that victory in single combat cannot solve. His authority, once unquestioned, has been challenged by the son of Peleus' withdrawal from battle. Murmurs of discontent ripple through the camp as men begin to question whether they're supreme. commander possesses the wisdom necessary to bring this long war to a successful conclusion. The crisis deepens when divine intervention shifts the balance of power in ways no mortal strategy can counter. Zeus, bound by his promise to silver-footed Thetis, begins to turn the tide of battle against the Argives. What once seemed like minor setbacks in skirmishes around Troy's walls escalate into serious defeats that threaten the very foundations of the expedition. The first sign comes with the failure of a dawn raid against Trojan outposts. Argive warriors, who have grown accustomed to easy victories over demoralized enemies, suddenly find themselves facing defenders filled with renewed confidence and divine favor. The attack that should have succeeded within hours drags on through the morning, then into the afternoon, until finally the raiders are forced to withdraw with heavy casualties and nothing to show. For their efforts, word spreads quickly through the camp that something has changed in the cosmic balance. The priests, who read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of sacrificial smoke, report troubling things. The auguries that once promised swift victory now speak of trials and tribulations ahead. Even the weather seems to have turned against them as clouds gather on previously clear horizons and winds shift to favor Trojan ships over Argive vessels. But it is on the battlefield itself that Zeus's favor becomes most apparent. Hector, emerging from Troy's gates at the head of a column of allied warriors, seems transformed from the cautious defender he has been into something approaching divine inspiration. His bronze spear finds its mark with uncanny act. His shield turns aside blows that should have pierced any mortal defense, and his very presence on the field fills his allies with courage while striking fear into Argive hearts. The transformation is not lost on Ithorami. Trojan warriors, who have spent years in defensive positions behind their walls, now advance across the plain with the confidence of men who believe the gods fight beside them. They press forward in disciplined formations, their bronze armor flashing in the sunlight, their war cries echoing off the ancient stones of their city's fortifications. Against this renewed Trojan confidence, the Argive response seems hesitant and disorganized. Without the son of Peleus to anchor their battle line, the individual champions find themselves unable to coordinate their efforts effectively. Each fights magnificently in isolation, but lacks the unifying presence that could weld them into an irresistible force. The pattern becomes clear as the morning advances. Where once Argive warriors could count on superior numbers and equipment to carry the day, they now face enemies who fight with the desperate courage of men defending their homes and the divine favor of gods who have chosen to support their cause. The balance that has maintained the siege's stalemate for 9 years begins to shift decisively in Troy's favor. Ajax Great, wielding his tower shield with the skill of long practice, finds himself giving ground for the first time in memory. The Trojan spears that ring against his bronze defense seem guided by supernatural accuracy, while his though devastating when they connect, somehow fail to break enemy formations as they once did. He fights with the same strength and courage that have made him legendary, but the very earth seems to resist his efforts. Diomedes, son of Tydeus, discovers that the divine favor which once allowed him to wound immortal Aphrodite and drive Ares himself from the battlefield has been withdrawn. His spear, which yesterday could pierce any armor, today finds its point turned by bronze that should offer no resistance. His chariot horses, once swift as the wind, now seemed to labor as if pulling weights. The god-blessed warrior has become merely mortal again, and the transition proves more difficult than he had ever imagined. Even Odysseus, master of strategy and cunning, finds his usual tactical brilliance inadequate to the changed circumstances. Plans that should succeed through superior preparation and execution, somehow go awry. At crucial moments, Allied contingents fail to arrive at their designated positions on time. Supply lines that have functioned reliably for years suddenly become unreliable. It is as if the very cosmos has turned against archive efforts, making success impossible despite their best efforts. The crisis reaches its crescendo when Hector leads a general assault against the Argive fortifications. The great wall that the invaders built to protect their camp, those mighty stones dragged from nearby hills and blessed by their priests, comes under attack from forces that seem to possess supernatural strength and determination. Where previous Trojan assaults have been repelled with relative ease, this attack threatens to overwhelm the defenders through sheer persistence and divine favor. The battle for the wall unfolds with the terrible intensity of mortal combat, blessed by immortal intervention, Trojan warriors scale the fortifications with ladders that somehow resist being pushed away by the defenders. Stones hurled from the ramparts miss their targets by impossible margins, while Trojan arrows find gaps in archive armor that should not exist. The very foundations of the wall seem to tremble under assault, as if the earth itself rebels against foreign presence. At the center of this supernatural storm stands Hector, transformed by Zeus' favor from skilled mortal warrior into something approaching a force of nature. His bronze spear cuts through enemy ranks like divine lightning, while his helmet deflects weapons that should pierce any mortal defense. He raises his voice in the war cry. Even veteran Argive warriors feel their courage falter, as if they face not merely another champion, but the embodiment of Troy's divine protection. The Argive heroes rally to defend their fortifications with desperate courage. Ajax, the great, plants himself before the main gate like a living tower, his shield covering the breach, while his long spear reaches out to strike down any enemy who approaches within range. Behind him, archers send volleys of arrows into the attacking ranks, while spearmen thrust through gaps in the wall to hold back the Trojan advance. Diomedes leads a counterattack along the eastern section of the fortifications, his bronze sword singing as it cuts through enemy ranks. Though he no longer possesses the divine favor that once made him invincible, his mortal courage and skill remain formidable. He carves a path through the Trojan assault force, buying precious time for his comrades to reorganize their defenses. Odysseus coordinates the overall defense with the tactical genius that has made him invaluable to the archive cause. He moves constantly along the ramparts, reinforcing weak points, repositioning reserves, and maintaining the communication that keeps the defense functioning as a coherent whole. His presence provides stability in a situation that threatens to dissolve into chaos. But despite their heroic efforts, the Argive defenders find themselves slowly pushed back. The divine favor that protects the Trojan assault proves too powerful for mortal courage alone to overcome. Section by section, the great wall begins to crumble under attacks that seem guided by supernatural force, though unthinkable, begins to seem inevitable. The fortifications that have protected the Argive camp for 9 years may finally be breached. It is at this moment of crisis that the true cost of the son of Pillus' withdrawal becomes apparent. The greatest warrior of the expedition remains in his tent, unmoved by the sounds of battle that grow ever closer to his own ships. His murmurants, Theolite fighters, who could turn the tide of any engagement, sit idle beside their vessels while their comrades fight desperately for survival. That the weapons that could save the day gather dust because pride proves stronger than duty. Yet, even in this darkest hour, the bonds that hold the Archive coalition together fuse to break entirely. veterans who have fought side by side for 9 years refuse to abandon their posts. Even when the situation seems hopeless, young warriors who have known no other life than this siege discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. The common soldiers whose names will never be remembered by history stand firm against odds that would break lesser men. The crisis deepens as Trojan forces finally breach Great Wall at its weakest point. Through the gap, poor warriors who have dreamed of this moment for 9 long years, their bronze weapons gleaming with reflected firelight as buildings in the archive camp begin to burn. The organized defense begins to fragment as units are cut off from central command and forced to fight as isolated bands of heroes. In this moment of apparent triumph for Troy, however, the seeds of future tragedy are already being sown. For Hector's success in driving the Argives back to their ships will set in motion the chain of events that leads to Patroclus dawning Achilles' armor, to Hais' death at Hector's hands, and to the terrible vengeance that will follow. The divine favor that makes this victory possible is the same force that will ultimately ensure Troy's destruction. The irony is lost on the combatants as they fight with desperate intensity for immediate survival. Trojan warriors press their advantage with the enthusiasm of men who see victory within their grasp. Argive defenders fall back toward their ships, not in panic, but in the controlled withdrawal of professional soldiers who understand that preservation of their forces matters more than holding every inch of ground. As the sun reaches its zenith, the battle reaches a turning point that will shape the entire character of the war. The age of stalemate is ending to bear placed by a period of rapid movement and decisive action that will test every participant to the limits of their endurance. The son of Peleus may remain apart from the fighting, but his absence has created conditions that will ultimately force him back into the conflict, under circumstances that will make his previous anger seem gentle by comparison. The afternoon brings fresh horrors as Trojan forces, emboldened by their success against the Argive fortifications, push their attack toward the ships themselves. These black vessels, drawn up on Thibych in careful rows, represent more than mere transportation. They are the lifeline that connects the expedition to its homeland, the means by which warriors might someday return to wives and children they have not seen for 9 years. Their destruction would transform a siege into exile, a military campaign into a fight for survival. Hector led Sid advance with the terrible joy of a man who sees his city's deliverance within reach. The bronze point of his spear flashes like captured lightning as he cuts through the enemy ranks, while his voice rings out with commands that organize the attack into an irresistible tide of destruction. Behind him, Trojan allies who have from the ends of the known world surge forward with renewed purpose, their various languaging into a single cry of victory. The Leons, under godlike Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, advance along the eastern flank with the disciplined precision of professional warriors. These men have served as mercenaries in conflicts across the ancient world, and their experience shows in the way they maintain formation even in the chaos of assault. Their bronze armor, marked with symbols of distant mountains, gleams with an otherworldly light that speaks to their divine leadership. From the northern reaches come the Thryans, wild horsemen whose very appearance strikes fear into settled peoples. Their long hair flows behind them as they charge, their war cries echoing like wolf howls across the battlefield. These warriors fight not for gold or glory, but for the sheer joy of combat, and their presence adds an element of savage unpredictability to the Trojan assault. The Dardanians, led by noble Anus son of Aphrodite and mortal Anchises, fight with the desperate courage of men defending their ancestral homeland. These warriors trace their lineage back to the founders of Troy itself. And they know that defeat means not merely military loss, but the extinction of their entire people. Their bronze spears thrust with the precision born of generational training, while their shields bear the ancient symbols of their royal house. Against this cosmopolitan alliance, the archive defense begins to fragment. The loss of their fortifications has forced them to fight on ground of their enemies' choosing, while the absence of their greatest champion deprives them of the psychological advantage they have enjoyed throughout the war. Individual heroes continue to perform magnificent deeds, but lack the coordination necessary to mount an effective counterattack. Ajax, the Great, finds himself fighting a defensive battle along the ship's hulls, his tower shield providing the only barrier between Trojan firebrands and the vessels that represent his people's only hope of return. The bronze point of his long spear reaches out again and again to strike down enemies who approach with flaming, but there are always more attackers than he can handle alone. Sweat runs down his face beneath his bronze helmet, mixing with blood from minor wounds that accumulate despite his skill at defense. Diomedes rallies a group of archive spearmen around the ship of his own contingent, organizing a defense that holds its ground through sheer stubborn courage. These warriors from Argos and Tyron have followed their young lord across the wine-dark sea in pursuit of glory, and they refuse to disgrace themselves by fleeing in panic. Their bronze-tipped spears form a hedge of death that slows the Trojan advance, but cannot stop it entirely. Odysseus coordinates the overall archive response with the tactical brilliance that has made him invaluable to their cause. He moves constantly between the various defensive positions, carrying orders and encouragement to isolated groups of fighters. His presence provides stability in a situation that threatens to collapse into complete chaos. But even his genius cannot solve the fundamental problem of fighting a defensive battle against superior numbers blessed with divine favor. The crisis deepens when Trojan warriors reach the ships themselves and begin to set them ablaze. These vessels, constructed from cedar wood wrought from the forests of Lebanon, will burn readily once the flames take hold. The sight of fire beginning to lick at the stern of the nearest ship sends a shock of terror through the archive ranks, for they understand that the destruction of their fleet would mean death far from home for every man among them. It is at this moment of supreme crisis that divine intervention saves the expedition from immediate destruction. Poseidon, the earth, observes the battle from his underwater palace and decides that Zeus's favor toward Troy has gone too far. The god of the sea may not dare to directly contradict his brother's will, but he can provide subtle assistance that shifts the balance just enough to prevent total archive collapse. The Earthshaker's intervention takes the form of renewed courage flowing through archive hearts at their moment of greatest need. Warriors who moments before seemed on the verge of breaking suddenly find fresh strength in their limbs and nudity in their spirits. The bronze of their weapons seems to shine with inner light, while their shields feel lighter and their spears more balanced in their hands. Ajax, the Great, feels the change, first as divine strength flows through his massive frame, like wine warming a man's blood. His tower shield, which had begun to feel impossibly heavy after hours of combat, suddenly seems as light as Ochild's toy. His long spear, which had started to drag with fatigue, now moves with the fluid grace of a serpent striking its prey. The war cry that breaks from his throat echoes across the battlefield like thunder from a clear sky. The effect spreads rapidly through the first ranks as Poseidon's divine favor counters Zeus's support for Troy. Warriors who had been giving ground steadily suddenly plant their feet and refuse to retreat another step. Spearmen who had been fighting defensively begin to push forward, their bronze points finding gaps in enemy armor with supernatural accuracy. The tide of battle, which had seemed to flow inexorably toward Trojan victory, begins to slow and then reverse direction. Diomedes leads a counterattack that carves deep into the Trojan formation, his sword singing as it cuts through enemy ranks with divine precision. The son of Tidus may no longer possess the overwhelming power that once allowed him to wound immortal gods, but Poseidon's favor grants him strength enough to match any mortal warrior on the field. His battle cry rallies the Argovespum around him, and together they begin to push the attackers back from the ships. The renewed Argive stance catches the Trojan forces by surprise. Warriors who, moments before, had been advancing confidently toward what seemed like certain victory, suddenly find themselves facing enemies through fight with supernatural determination. The easy triumph that had appeared within their grasp begins to slip away as divine favor shifts once again between the opposing sides. Hector, sensing the change in cosmic balance, redoubles his own efforts to break through the Argive defense. The greatest of Priam's sons understands that this moment represents Troy's best chance for decisive victory, and that failure now might mean the loss of their one opportunity to end the siege on favorable terms. His bronze spear flashes like lightning as he seeks a weakness in the enemy line, while his voice rings out with commands that attempt to maintain Trojan momentum. But even Hector's magnificent courage cannot entirely overcome the shift in divine favor. The warriors who had followed him with such confidence begin to hesitate as they encounter resistance that seems to grow stronger rather than weaker. The ships that had seemed ready to burst into flames somehow resist the torch's thrust against their hulls, while the Argive defenders appear to multiply than diminish as the battle continues. The stalemate that results from this clash of divine influences creates some of the most intense fighting the war has yet witnessed. Neither side can gain decisive advantage, but neither can afford to withdraw from positions they have purchased with so much blood. This space between the ships and the breach in the Argive wall becomes a killing ground, where heroes fall like grain for the reaper's blade. In this crucible of combat, individual acts of heroism shine like stars against the darkness of mass slaughter. Sarpedon Ondis' cousin Glalus lead elation, assault that nearly reaches the ships before being driven back by Ajax's counterattack. Aeneas and Hector coordinate their efforts to break through the Argive center, only to find themselves facing Damadas and a picket band of Argive champions who refuse to yield another step. The battle rages through the afternoon without decisive result as divine favor shifts back and forth between the opposing forces. Zeus's support for Troy contends with Poseidon's assistance to the Argives, creating conditions where mortal courage and skill matter more than supernatural intervention. The warriors on both sides fight with knowledge that everything they have struggled for hangs in the balance of this single engagement, as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of bronze and crimson. The intensity of combat reaches levels that test even veteran warriors to their limits. Men who have fought for 9 years discover reserves of strength and determination they never knew they possessed. The very air seems to crackle with tension as heroes push themselves beyond all previous boundaries of endurance. Yet, despite the magnificent courage displayed by warriors on both sides, the fundamental dynamics of the conflict remain unchanged. The son of Peleus continues to brood beside his ships, his terrible anger unassuaged by the desperate battle raging around him. His myrmidons, the finest fighters in the archive host, remain idle while their comrades die for want of their spears. The weapons that could turn the tide of battle gather dust because pride proves stronger than duty. The irony of the situation is not lost in those who understand the larger patterns at work. The very crisis that threatens to destroy the archive expedition is creating the conditions that will eventually force the son of Pelis back into battle under circumstances that will make his previous withdrawal seem insignificant by comparison. The divine favor that enables Hector's success is the same force that will ultimately ensure his destruction. But for now, in this moment of desperate struggle, such larger patterns remain invisible to the combatants who fight with everything they possess for immediate survival. The battle continues to rage as darkness approaches, each side knowing that the next few hours may determine whether Troy stands unconquered or falls in flames, whether the archive expedition returns in triumph or perishes on foreign shores far from the graves of their monsters. The approaching night brings with it the promise of temporary respite from combat, but also the knowledge that tomorrow will bring fresh challenges and new tests of courage. For this war has passed beyond the point where simple military victory can resolve the fundamental tensions that drive it. Too much blood has been spilled. Too many heroes have fallen. Too many oaths have been sworn in the presence of the gods for any easy resolution to be possible. The second phase of this ancient tale draws to its close with the recognition that the conflict has entered a new and more dangerous stage. The age of stalemate is ending, to be replaced by a period of rapid movement and decisive action that will test every participant to the limits of their humanity. The son of Pelis may remain apart from the fighting, but forces are already in motion that will drag him back into the conflict under circumstances that will transform his personal anger into something far more terrible and far more consequential. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above the wine-dark plain, both armies draw back from the field of slaughter to tend their wounds and count their losses. The temporary cessation of combat brings not relief, but grim recognition of how much the day's fighting has cost. Both the ground between Troy's walls and the archive ships lies carpeted with bronzed flesh, testament to the fury that divine intervention can unleash when immortal wills clash through mortal instruments. In the Trojan camp, Hector strips the blood from his spear and armor as his captains gather around him in the flickering light of torches. The greatest of Priam's sons has led his people closer to decisive victory than any previous effort has achieved. Yet he knows that the opportunity may already be slipping away. The divine favor that blessed their assault shows signs of wavering, while the Argive resistance has proven more resilient than even his most pessimistic advisors had predicted. "We have driven them to their ships," announces Sarpedon, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a warrior who hasten his enemies flee before him. The Lucian prince bears fresh wounds from days fighting, but his spirit remains unbroken by the ordeal. One more so like today's, and their black holes will burn on the beach while their crews flee across the wine-dark sea. But Hector's expression remains troubled as he gazes across the darkened battlefield with the enemy camp. Something in the afternoon's fighting has disturbed him. Some shift in the cosmic balance that his warrior's instincts detect. Even if his mind cannot fully comprehend its implications, the resistance they encountered grew stronger rather than weaker as the battle progressed, suggesting forces at work beyond simple mortal courage. The Earthshaker intervenes, murmurs Polydamas, wisest of Troy's counselors, his weathered face grave in the torchlight. I felt his presence in the way the enemy ranks reformed when they should have broken, in the strength that flowed through Argives' spears when their wielders should have been exhausted. Zeus favors us, but his brother favors our enemies. The observation sends a chill through the assembled commanders, for they understand its implications. If the gods themselves are divided over the war's outcome, then mortal efforts alone may prove insufficient to achieve a decisive victory. The intervention of Poseidon suggests that the cosmic forces supporting Troiscus are not as unified as they had hoped, creating conditions where their greatest successes may be countered by divine opposition. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, speaks with the authority of one whose divine heritage grants him insight into immortal affairs. The blessed ones play their own games with mortal lives. He observes, his voice carrying both reverence and bitterness. We are pieces on their board, moved according to purposes we cannot fully understand. Our role is to fight with courage, regardless of the outcome they decree. The Dardanian prince's words remind the assembly that they are not merely warriors fighting for tactical advantage, but participants in a cosmic drama whose ultimate resolution lies beyond their control. Yet this recognition does not diminish their determination to pursue victory through their own efforts. For the alternative is to surrender agency entirely to forces beyond mortal influence. In the archive camp, a similar council takes place around the dying embers of though the mood there carries undertones of desperation absent from the Trojan gathering. The near breach of their fortifications has shaken even veteran campaigners who have survived 9 years of siege warfare. The proximity of total defeat has forced them to confront the possibility that their great expedition might end not in glorious victory, but in catastrophic agony. Agamemnon sits silent among his captains, the weight of supreme command evident in every line of his posture. The King of Kings has spent the day watching his carefully constructed Colion nearly disintegrate under divine pressure, and the experience has taught him hard lessons about the limits of mortal authority. His royal regalia seems somehow diminished in the flickering firelight, as if the bronze and gold have lost their power to inspire, or we cannot withstand another assault like today's. Ajax the great states, with the blunt honesty that characterizes his approach to all challenges, the tower of Argive strength bears multiple wounds from the day's fighting, but his voice remains steady as he delivers his assessment. Our wall is breached, our ships are threatened, and our men fight with the desperation of cornered animals rather than the confidence of conquering heroes. Diomedes nods grimly at his comrade's words, his own experience confirming the dire nature of their situation. The cosmic balance has shifted against us. He observes, the silence that falls over the battlefield when the last trumpet fades is not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. For nearly 2 centuries, the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe have held themselves against the fortified cities of the Holy Land. Like waves against an unyielding shore, Jerusalem has been won and lost, and won again. Antioch has seen its streets runned with the blood of both cross-bearer and crescent-bearer. The dream that began with Pope Urban's thunderous call at Clermont in 1095 has transformed into something far more complex than those first zealous pilgrims could have imagined. As the 13th century dawns, the crusading movement stands at a crossroads. The great victories of the First Crusade seem like distant memories, faded tapestries hanging in the halls of kings who now face very different challenges. The unified Muslim resistance under Saladin has given way to a fractured political landscape where Obid Prince compete with Mamluk strongmen for dominance over the Levantine coast. The Crusader states themselves have evolved from the rough military colonies established by Godfrey of Billon and his companions into sophisticated political entities that must navigate the treacherous waters of near-Eastern diplomacy. In Acre, the last great Christian stronghold on the eastern Mediterranean shore, merchants from Venice and Genoa haggle over spice prices in markets where Arabic mingles freely with Latin and French. The city's massive walls rebuilt after Saladin's conquest and Richard the Lionheart's recapture cast long shadows over a cosmopolitan population that includes not only Latin Christians but also Eastern Orthodox believers, Armenian merchants, Syrian, and even Muslim traders operating under carefully negotiated safe passage agreements. The military orders that once embodied the pure martial spirit of the crusading ideal have themselves become complex international organizations. The Knights Templar operate a banking work that stretches from London to Cyprus. Their red crosses on white mantles, now as likely to be seen in counting houses as on battlefields. The Hospitallers have transformed their original mission of caring for pilgrims into a sophisticated medical and military operation that maintains hospitals throughout the eastern Mediterranean while simultaneously fielding some of the finest heavy cavalry in the Teutonic Knights, having found limited opportunities in the Holy Land, have turned their attention northward to the pagan tribes of the Baltic, where they pursue conquest and conversion with the same methodical efficiency their predecessors once brought to the siege of Jerusalem. Yet beneath this surface adaptation to new realities, the fundamental tensions that have always characterized the crusading movement continue to simmer. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, view the eastern Mediterranean primarily as a theater for commercial competition. Their magnificent fleets are likely to fight each other as to transport pilgrims or provisions to the Holy Land. The Byzantine Empire, once the original petitioner for Western military assistance, now regards the Latin states as dangerous neighbors, who have proven themselves quite capable of turning their weapons against Constantinoplites, as the horrific events of 1204 demonstrated. In Rome, the papal court struggles to maintain control over a movement that thus repeatedly escaped the bounds of its original spiritual purpose. Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pontiff in Christian history, has expanded the concept of crusading beyond the Holy Land to encompass campaigns against heretics in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, and even political enemies of the Papal State in Italy itself. This theological innovation has provided the Church with a powerful tool for enforcing orthodoxy and extending papal authority, but it has also diluted the special character that once made the Jerusalem pilgrimage a uniquely compelling spiritual exercise. The Fourth Crusade's catastrophic diversion to Constantinople continues to cast a shadow over our subsequent expeditions. The sight of Latin knights sacking the greatest Christian city in the world, melting down ancient icons for their gold content, and desecrating altars that had witnessed centuries of liturgical worship, has created a wound in the body of Christendom that shows no signs of healing. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to a rump state centered on Nikka, views any Western military expedition with deep suspicion, while the newly established Latin Empire of Constantinople struggles to maintain legitimacy in the face of Greek Orthodox hostility and its own internal contradictions. Against this backdrop of political fragmentation and spiritual uncertainty, new voices begin to emerge that will fundamentally transform the nature of Christian engagement with the Islamic world. In the hills of Umbria, a young merchant's son named Giovanni Diatro de Bernardine experiences a series of mystical visions that lead him to abandon his comfortable life for one of radical poverty and evangelical preaching. Francis of Assisi, as he will become known, represents a revolutionary approach to the Islamic world. Not conquest through force of arms, but conversion through the power of Christian example and direct spiritual dialogue. The Franciscan mission to the Islamic world begins not with military planning, but with a radical act of faith. In 1219, as the Fifth Crusade, Bezigistamata, in the Nile Delta, Francis himself crosses the battle lines under a flag of truce and requests an audience with Al-Kamil, the Orbid Sultan of Egypt. The meeting between the poverty-embracing Christian mystic and the sophisticated Muslim ruler represents a profound alternative to the military confrontation that has characterized Christian-Islamic relations for over a century. Contemporary accounts of this encounter, filtered through the hagiographical traditions that quickly grew up around Francis, suggest a meeting of remarkable mutual respect. Al-Kamil, grandson of the great Saladin, and himself a patron of Islamic scholarship and poetry, receives the Christian holy man with courtesy and genuine interest. The Sultan's court includes scholars familiar with Christian theology, and the theological discussions that ensue reveal the sophisticated intellectual culture of Orbid Egypt, where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions intersect in ways the crude stereotypes of crusading propaganda had never acknowledged. Francis's approach to the Islamic world is revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than seeking to demonstrate the superiority of Christian civilization through military conquest or political domination, he attempts to embody the radical love that he believes lies at the heart of the Christian message. His voluntary poverty, his care for the sick and outcast, his evident sincerity and lack of personal ambition create a profound impression on Muslim observers who have grown accustomed to associating Christianity with the violence and rapacity of crusading armies. The Franciscan missions that follow Francis's pioneering journey establish a new model for Christian engagement with the Islamic world. Unlike the military expeditions that sought to carve out territorial enclaves through force of arms, these missions operate through persuasion, example, and the gradual building of relationships across religious boundaries. Franciscan friars learn Arabic, study Islamic theology, and develop sophisticated apologetic arguments designed not to demonize Islam, but to demonstrate the truth of Christian revelation through rational discourse and lived witness. This new approach finds its most sophisticated crease in the work of Ramon Lull, a Catalan nobleman who experiences his own dramatic conversion and dedicates his life to the peaceful conversion of Muslims and Jews. Lull's art of finding truth represents an ambitious attempt to develop a logical system capable of demonstrating Christian truth in ways that would be compelling to adherents of other monotheistic traditions. His repeated journeys to North Africa, his mastery of Arabic language and Islamic philosophy, and his eventual martyrdom in Bougie in 1315 establish him as the prototype of a new kind of Christian missionary, one who seeks to understand rather than to conquer. Yet, even as these new approaches to Christian-Islamic dialogue develop, the traditional military framework of the crusading movement continues to evolve in response to changing political. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, represents an attempt to learn from the strategic mistakes of previous expeditions. Rather than targeting Jerusalem directly, the expedition's planners recognize that control of Egypt is the key to sustainable dominance over entire eastern Mediterranean region. Egypt's agricultural wealth provides the economic foundation for Orbid power, while its position astride the trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean makes it the natural center of any successful Islamic coalition. The siege of Dammata, becomes a test case for new approaches to crusading warfare. The city's position on the Nile Delta requires the development of naval capabilities that previous expeditions have lacked. Venetian and Genoese fleets provide not only transportation but also specialized equipment, designed specifically for amphibious operations. The famous chain tower that guards Demeter's harbor becomes the focus of a complex engineering challenge that results in the construction of floating siege engines and the development of new techniques for conducting warfare in riverine environments. The successful capture of Demeter in November 1219 represents a significant military achievement, but it also reveals the continuing political divisions that plague crusading. The papal legate Pelagius, armed with extensive authority from Rome, clashes reportedly with secular leaders over strategy and objectives. King John of Brienne, nominal ruler of Jerusalem, advocates for a cautious approach that would consolidate Christian control over the Nile Delta before attempting further advance. Pelagius, convinced that divine providence has destined the expedition for complete victory, insists on an immediate advance toward Cairo. The advance up the Nile in July 1221 becomes a disaster that rivals the worst defeats in crusading history. Al-Kamil's strategic flooding of the Nile Delta traps the Christian army in a landscape transformed into an impossible marsh. The technological superiority that enabled the capture of Demeter becomes irrelevant in an environment where heavy cannot operate and supply lines cannot be maintained. The expedition's surrender and withdrawal represent not merely a military defeat, but a fundamental challenge to the theological attempts that have sustained the crusading movement. The failure of the Fifth Crusade catalyzes a remarkable diplomatic revolution that will reshape the entire context of Christian engagement with the Islamic world. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, inherits not only the crusading vow of his predecessor, but also a unique perspective on Christian-Islamic relations shaped by his rule over Sicily's multi-religious population. Frederick's court in Palermo includes Muslim scholars, Jewish physicians, and Christian theologians who collaborate in an atmosphere of intellectual exchange that would be impossible in most European centers. Frederick's approach to the crusade reflects this cosmopolitan background. Rather than viewing the expedition as a religious war between incompatible civilizations, he treats it as a complex diplomatic challenge that can be resolved through negotiation among sophisticated delicate actors who happen to adhere to different religious traditions. His correspondence with Al-Kamil reveals to rulers who share similar interests in philosophy, mathematics, and political theory, and who view their religious differences as obstacles to be overcome rather than fundamental barriers to cooperation. The negotiations that culminate in the Treaty of Jaffa in February 1229 represent perhaps the most sophisticated diplomatic achievement in the entire history of the Crusades. The agreement grants Christians control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, along with a corridor connecting these holy sites to the coast at Acre. Muslims threaten control over the Temple Mount with its sacred dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, while Christians regain access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sites associated with the life of Jesus. The treaty's innovative approach to religious coexistence establishes principles that prefigure modern concepts of religious freedom and minority rights. Christians and Muslims are guaranteed the right to worship freely in areas controlled by the other faith, while merchants and pilgrims from both communities receive protection and trading privileges throughout the region. The agreement even includes provisions for joint administration of disputed sites and mechanisms for resolving conflicts through arbitration rather than warfare. Frederick's bloodless recovery of Jerusalem through diplomacy, rather than conquest, represents a fundamental gong to the military culture that has dominated the crusading movement for over a century. The emperor's coronation as King of Jerusalem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, performed by his own hands in the absence of any clergy willing to participate in the ceremony, symbolizes both the achievement and the isolation that his unorthodox method shave created. The reaction to Frederick's diplomatic triumph reveals the deep tensions within Latin Christendom over the proper relationship between religious conviction and political pragmatism. Pope Gregory IX, locked in a broader conflict with Frederick over imperial authority in Italy, denounces the Triatius, an unacceptable compromise with infidel power. The Patriarch of Jerusalem places the city under interdict, arguing that a Jerusalem controlled through negotiation with Muslims cannot be considered truly liberal. And many of the military orders view Frederick's success with suspicion, recognizing that his diplomatic methods threaten their institutional rise. Yet, Frederick's achievement also demonstrates possibilities for Christian Islamic coexistence that inspire new approaches to interfaith dialogue throughout the Mediterranean world. The Treaty of Jaffa becomes a model for subsequent agreements between Christian and Muslim rulers, establishing precedents for religious tolerance and commercial cooperation that will influence diplomatic practice for centuries to come. The emperor's court in Sicily continues to serve as a center for cross-cultural exchange, where Islamic scientific texts are translated into Latin and Christian theologic works are rendered into Arabic. The intellectual ferment generated by cultural exchange contributes to the remarkable flowering of medieval philosophy and science in the 13th century. The works of Averroes and Avicenna, transmitted through Sicilian and Spanish translation, centers profoundly influence Christian thinkers like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. The Aristotelian revival that transforms European universities begins with Islamic commentaries that preserve and extend Greek philosophical traditions. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that enables the development of Gothic architecture and improved navigation techniques derives largely from Islamic sources, transmitted through these cross-cultural networks. Yet, even as diplomatic and intellectual exchange creates new possibilities for Christian Islamic understanding, the fundamental military challenge posed by Islamic resurgence continues to evolve. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt represents a new phase in the long struggle for dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike the Orbid princes, who were often willing to negotiate with Christian rulers as equals, the Mamluk military elite views the Crusader states as anachronistic vestiges of an earlier era that must be systematically eliminated. The Mamluk military system represents a revolutionary approach to warfare that combines the traditional strengths of Islamic cavalry with new technologies and organizational methods borrowed from their conflicts with the Mongols. The Mamluk warrior, trained from childhood in specialized military misraprists, a new type of professional soldier whose skills surpassed those of both the feudal levies and the militia orders that form the backbone of Christian resistance. The Mamluk composite bow, capable of penetrating the heaviest European armor at ranges that Western crossbows cannot match, gives Islamic forces a decisive technological advantage in siege warfare. The systematic Mamluk conquest of the Crusader states begins with the capture of Antioch in 1268. A siege that demonstrates the new level of military sophistication that Islamic forces have achieved. The city's massive fortifications, which had withstood numerous previous sieges, crumble before the concentrated fire of Mamluk mangonels and trebuchets operated by engineers trained in the latest Chinese and Persian siege techniques. The fall of Antioch, one of the first and greatest Crusader conquests, sent shock waves throughout Latin Christendom and marks the beginning of the end for the Latin presence in Villa. Sultan Bibas, the Mamluk leader who orchestrates this final phase of Islamic reconquest, represents a new type of Islamic leader whose methods combine traditional Ghazi warfare with sophisticated intelligence networks and psychological warfare. Bibas's use of carrier pigeons to coordinate military operations across vast distances gives his forces unprecedented strategic, while his network of spies and informants within the Crusader states provides detailed intelligence about Christian military preparations and political divisions. The systematic nature of Mamluk conquest reflects a strategic vision that seeks not merely to defeat Christian armies in battle, but to eliminate the entire infrastructure that has sustained the Latin presence in the East. Captured fortifications are not merely garrisoned, but systematically dismissed to prevent future Christian attempts at reconquest. Christian populations are not simply subjugated, but often deported or eliminated entirely to prevent the emergence of fifth columns that might assist future crusading expeditions. The Mamluk approach to conquest represents total war in a sense that earlier Islamic leaders had rarely contemplated. The siege of Acre in 1291 becomes the final act in this drama of systematic. The city's massive fortifications, strengthened and expanded over 2 centuries of continuous conflict, represent the pinnacle of medieval military engineering. The harbour installations that have made a commercial heart of the Crusader states rival those of Venice and Constantinople in their sophistication. The city's cosmopolitan population includes not only Latin Christians, but also Eastern Orthodox believers, Armenians, Syrians, and even Muslim merchants, who have prospered under the relatively tolerant administration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Mamluk siege of Acre employs every technique of medieval warfare, developed over 2 centuries of Christian-Islamic conflict. Massive siege engines hurl stone projectiles weighing over 300 pounds against the city's walls, while miners tunnel beneath the fortifications to undermine their foundations. The city's harbour is blockaded by a Mamluk fleet that prevents any possibility of relief or evacuation by sea. For the first time in the history of the Crusades, Islamic forces possess clear superiority in both technology and resources, making the outcome of the siege a foregone conclusion. The fall of Acre on May 18, 1291, marks not merely the end of a particular military campaign, but the conclusion of nearly 2 centuries of Latin political presence in the Levant. The systematic destruction of the city's fortifications and the elimination of its Christian population ensure that no future expedition will find any infrastructure on which to build a renewed Crusader presence. The Mamluk policy of creating what modern strategists would call a defensive desert along the Palestinian coast reflects a sophisticated understanding of the strategic requirements for preventing future Christian conquest attempts. The news of Acre's fall reaches Europe at a time when the political and social foundations of the crusading movement have already been fundamentally put. The rise of centralized monarchies in France and England has shifted the balance of power away from the feudal nobility, who provided the military backbone of early expeditions. The development of professional armies equipped with new weapons like the crossbow and the longbow has made the heavy cavalry charge, the foundation of crusading warfare, increasingly obsolete. The intellectual and spiritual climate of late 13th century Europe has evolved in ways that make the simple certainties of earlier crusading propaganda difficult to sustain. The translation of Islamic philosophical and scientific works has created a more sophisticated understanding of Islamic civilization among European intellectuals. The growth of universities and the development of scholastic theology have produced new approaches to Christian Islamic. Dialogue would emphasize rational argument over military conquest. The response to Acca's fall reveals these deep in European consciousness, while traditional calls for new expeditions continue to emanate from the papal court. They generate little of the popular enthusiasm that had characterized earlier crusading. The French monarchy, now the dominant power in Western Europe, shows more interest in consolidating its control over southern France and expanding into the Low Countries than in expensive Eastern Mediterranean adventures. The English are absorbed in their ongoing conflicts with Scotland and Wales, while the German princes remain divided among themselves and focused on local concerns. Perhaps most significantly, new forms of Christian spirituality have emerged that offer alternatives to the military ideology that had sustained the crusading movement. The mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, emphasize poverty, preaching, and peaceful conversion over armed conquest. The mystical traditions associated with figures like Meister Eckhart and the Rhineland mystics stress inner spiritual transformation rather than external military achievement. The growing influence of familiar religious figures like Mechild of Magdeburg and Marguerite Perita suggests new approaches to religious experiences that transcend the masculine military culture of traditional crusading spirituality. Yet, even as the military phase of the crusading movement draws to a close, its intellectual and cultural legacy continues to shape European development in profound ways. The maritime technologies developed for crusading expeditions contribute to the expansion of European trade networks that will eventually span the globe. The organizational methods pioneered by the military orders influenced the development of banking, agriculture, and urban administration throughout Europe. The legal concepts developed for governing multi-religious societies in the Crusader states provide precedents for addressing religious diversity in European kingdoms. Most importantly, the encounter with Islamic civilization has fundamentally expanded European intellectual horizons in ways that will prove decisive for future cultural development. The Aristotelian philosophy, transmitted through Islamic sources, becomes the foundation for scholastic theology and the university system. Islamic, mathematical, and astronomical knowledge enables the navigation techniques that will make possible the age of Islamic medical knowledge preserved and extended in centers like Cordoba and Baghdad, revolutionizes European medical practice and contributes to the demographic expansion that characterizes the High Middle Ages. The artistic and architectural legacy of Crusades proves equally transformative. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and other structural innovations developed in Islamic architecture influenced the emergence of the Gothic style that will transform European cathedral building. The decorative techniques and encountered in Islamic art contribute to the development of new aesthetic approaches in European script illumination and metalwork. Even the literary traditions of medieval Europe show profound Islamic influence. From the courtly romance cycles that incorporate Oriental themes to the philosophical allegories that reflect Islamic narrative techniques. As the 14th century dawned, the word crusade itself begins to acquire new meanings that extend far beyond its original military context. Papal Aforsto organize expeditions for the recovery of the Holy Land continue throughout the century, but they increasingly serve as financial instruments rather than serious military enterprises. The crusading ideal becomes attached to other conflicts. the Reconquista in Iberia, the wars against pagans in the Baltic, the struggle against Ottoman expansion in the Balkans, that have their own distinct characteristics and motivations. The transformation of crusading from a specific historical movement into a more general cultural metaphor reflects the profound changes that 2 centuries of Eastern Mediterranean warfare have wrought in European consciousness. The simple binary opposition between Christian and Muslim, believer and infidel, that had sustained the original crusading ideology, has given way to a more complex understanding of religious and cultural difference. The encounter with Islamic civilization has revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of religious warfare as an instrument of cultural transformation. In the monasteries and universities of 14th century Europe, scholars begin the long process of interpreting and reinterpreting the crusading experience. New generations who will face very different challenges. The historical chronicles that preserve the memory of these expeditions become sources not only for understanding the past, but for imagining alternative futures. The theological treatises that attempted to justify or criticize crusading warfare contribute to evolving theories of just war and international law. The literary works that romanticize or critique the crusading ideal help to shape new forms of cultural expression. Thought will characterize the late medieval and early modern periods. Perhaps most significantly, the crusading experience has demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of religious enthusiasm as a force for historical change. The extraordinary achievements of the First Crusade, the sophisticated arrangements of the Crusader states, and the remarkable cultural exchange that characterized a centuries of Christian Islamic encounter all testify to the creative potential that can be unleashed when religious conviction is channeled through effective institutional structures. Yet the ultimate failure of the crusading project to achieve its stated objectives also reveals the dangers inherent in any attempt to impose religious solutions on complex political problems. The repeated cycles of conquest and the enormous human costs of 2 centuries of warfare, and the persistent inability of military success to generate lasting political stability, all suggest the limitations of force as an instrument of religious or cultural transformation. As the medieval period gradually gives way to the early modern era, the crusading legacy will continue to influence European development in ways both obvious and subtle. The maritime expansion that carries European power to the Americas and Asia draws heavily on technologies and organizational methods pioneered during the Eastern Mediterranean expeditions. The colonial enterprises that establish European dominance over much of the non-European world often employ ideological justifications that echo crusading themes of religious mission and cultural superiority. Yet the same period also witnesses the development of new approaches to religious and cultural diversity that reflect lessons learned from the crusading experience. The concept of religious tolerance, the principles of international law, and the ideals of cultural exchange that will characterize the Enlightenment all have in the complex interactions between Christian and Islamic civilizations during the medieval period. The story of the Crusades thus represents more than simply a chapter in medieval military history. It constitutes a foundational experience in the long process by which European civilization defined itself in relation to the wider world. The encounter with Islamic civilization that these expeditions initiated continues to shape global politics and culture in ways that would have been unimaginable to the warriors who first answered Urban II's call at Clermont. As we trace the final transformation of crusading idealism into the more complex realities of later medieval politics and culture, We can see reflected in this transformation the broader patterns that have characterized human civilization throughout history, the tension between religious conviction and political pragmatism, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances, and the eternal human struggle to balance idealism with realism. All of these universal themes find expression in the particular story of the Crusades. The silence that finally settles over the battlefields of the Levant is thus not the silence of ending, but of transformation. The dreams and nightmares, the triumphs and tragedies, the hopes and fears that motivated 2 centuries of crusading warfare have not disappeared, but have been absorbed into the larger stream of human experience. They continue to flow beneath the surface of subsequent history, sometimes emerging in new forms, sometimes remaining hidden, but always present as part of the vast accumulation of human memory and aspiration that connects each generation to those that have gone before. In this way, the Crusades become not merely a historical phenomenon to be studied and understood, but a continuing part of the human story that each generation must interpret anew for itself. The questions that the Crusaders faced about the relationship between faith and violence, about the possibilities and limitations of cultural encounter, about the meaning of religious commitment in a complex world, remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago. The answers that each generation provides to these questions will determine not only how the crusading legacy is remembered, but how its deeper insights contribute to the ongoing human quest for meaning, justice, and peace. The son of Polis had finally returned to the field of battle, terrible in his diving armor, and burning with a desire for vengeance. Yet, even as his bronze spear drank deeply of Trojan blood, the war itself had begun to evolve beyond the comprehension of mortal heroes. For 9 long years, this conflict had been fought according to ancient rules. Champions met in single combat, while armies watched. Gods intervened openly on behalf of their favorites. Honor and glory meant more than strategic advantage. But the slaughter unleashed by Achilles' wrath marked the beginning of something different. A new kind of warfare, where divine fury and mortal technology combined to create destruction on an unprecedented scale. The first sign of this transformation came not from the Greek camp, but from the very walls of Troy itself. As Hector's funeral fires burned low, and his ashes were gathered in their golden urn, the city's defenders knew that conventional tactics could no longer protect them from the terror that prowled outside their gates. The son of Polis had become something more than human, less than God. A force of nature that could not be turned aside by bronze spears or noble courage. In the councils of Troy, voices began to whisper of desperate measures. Some spoke of magical weapons hidden in the deepest vaults of Priam's palace, artifacts from the age when gods walked openly among men. Others suggested appealing to powers beyond Olympus, to the primordial forces that had existed before Zeus claimed his throne. But Priam, aged and broken by his son's death, could only weep and speak of his remaining children, who would soon follow Hector to the house of Hades. Meanwhile, the Greek camp buzzed with fresh hope. The return of their great warrior had shifted the entire dynamic of the siege. Where once they had been content to raid and plunder, now they spoke openly of storming Troy's walls and putting Thessaly to the torch. The sight of Achilles in his divine armor, terrible as the God-deaf war himself, had reminded them why they had crossed the wine-dark sea in the first place. But the war's evolution was perhaps most visible in the way it now consumed everything in its path. The countryside around Troy once dotted with prosperous farms and thriving villages, had become a wasteland of ash and bone. The sacred groves where shepherds once made offerings to the gods had been stripped bare for Alps. Even the great river Scamander, defiled by Achilles' slaughter, ran red with blood and choked with corpses. This was no longer the heroic conflict that poets would sing about in golden halls. It had become something darker, more primal, a war that threatened to devour not just the combatants, but thievery, principles of civilization itself. The careful balance between divine intervention and mortal agency that had governed conflict since the Age of Heroes was cracking under the weight of accumulated hatred and divine wrath. The gods themselves seemed to sense the change on Olympus. The easy confidence that had marked their earlier interventions gave way to something approaching concern. Zeus, who had once been content to watch mortals play out their eternal dramas of love and hate, now found himself weighing consequences that might extend far beyond the walls of Troy. The war that had begun with a golden apple and a judgment clouded by desire was threatening to become something that could reshape the relationship between heaven and earth forever. In the Trajanpolis, Queen Hecuba worked her loom with trembling fingers, weaving patterns that seemed to shift and change before her eyes. Some said the gods had touched her with gift of prophecy, that she could see in her threads the fates of all her children yet to fall. Others whispered that grief had simply driven her mad, that she wove shrouds for sons still living, because she could no longer distinguish between past and future. In her sorrow, Prince Paris, the beautiful shepherd who had started this war with his theft of Helen, now walked the walls of Troy like a man haunted by ghosts. The confident youth who had once believed that Aphrodite's favor could shield him from all consequences had aged years in the span of days since his brother's death. He still carried his silver bow, still commanded the respect due to a son of Priam, but something essential had died in him when he saw Hector's corpse dragged behind Achilles' chariot. Even Helen herself, the face that had launched 1,000 ships, seemed diminished by the weight of what her beauty had wrought. She spent her days in the highest tower of the palace, gazing out over the battlefield where men died daily for her sake. Some said she was weaving a great tapestry that depicted all the struggles fought in her name, as if by capturing them in thread and dye, she could somehow make sense of the destruction that followed in her wake. The common soldiers on both sides this change most acutely. Veterans who had fought for 9 years spoke in hushed tones of how different this war had become. Where once there had been rules, unspoken but understood by all, now there seemed to be only the logic of escalation. Each act of brutal incitement a response in kind. Each violation of custom made the next transgression easier to justify. Young, who had grown to manhood during the siege, knew no other reality than this. They had learned to fight not for glory or honor, but for survival in a world where mercy was weakness and hesitation meant death. They watched Achilles drag Hector's corpse around Troy's walls and saw not an abomination that violated every principle of civilized warfare, but simply the natural progression of a conflict that had long since abandoned such necessities. The priests in both camps struggled to make sense of divine will in this new reality. How could the gods, who had once seemed to follow comprehensible laws of favor and disfavor, now permit such chaos to reign? Some began to whisper that the war had somehow broken free of divine control, that mortal hatred had grown so intense it could override even the will of Zeus himself. But perhaps the most disturbing change was in the nature of heroism itself. The old ideal of the noble warrior who fought with honor and treated his enemies with respect seemed increasingly obsolete. Achilles, the greatest hero of his age, had become something that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. A figure of pure vengeance, beautiful and terrible, who acknowledged no loss, save his own grief. This transformation was most visible in how he treated not just his enemies, Buthus' own comrades. Where once he had been content to sulk in his tent when his honor was slighted, now he seemed to burn with a fire that consumed everything around him. His fellow Greeks found themselves both ardent, terrified by their greatest champion, never knowing whether his divine wrath might turn against them if they somehow displeased him. The weapons themselves seemed to be evolving as well. The simple bronze spears and swords that had equipped warriors since the age of heroes now shared the battlefield, with more exotic implements of war, arrows tipped with poisons that could kill with a scratch, chariots fitted with scythed wheels that could mow down infantry like wheat, siege engines capable of hurling massive stones over highest walls. Some whispered that the gods themselves were providing these innovations, as if immortals had grown bored with the stately pace of traditional warfare and sought to accelerate the conflict toward its inevitable conclusion. Others suggested that mortal ingenuity, sharpened by 9 years of desperate struggle, was simply discovering new ways to kill more efficiently. The very landscape around Troy bore witness to this evolution. What had once been a pastoral region of rolling hills and fertile valleys had been transformed into something resembling the antechamber of Hades itself. The earth was scarred with trenches and ramparts. The air hung thick with the smoke of constant funeral. P.S. Even the weather seemed affected, as if the gods themselves were mourning the corruption of what had once been their favorite entertainment. Yet for all these changes, certain eternal truths remained. Men still died far from home, calling out for their mothers in their final moments. Women still wept for husbands, and Sancho would never return. Children still played at being warriors, not understanding that the real thing had become something far darker than their innocent games could capture. Fewer that had begun as a matter of honor. A wronged husband seeking justice for his stolen wife had become something that consumed honor itself. The careful distinctions between right and wrong, between civilization and barbarism, between human and divine, were being ground down like grain between millstones. What would emerge from this process? None could say. As the moon set over the wine-dark sea and dawn approached with its promise or fresh violence, both armies prepared for another day of slaughter. But they were no longer quite the same forces that had faced each other across these blood-soaked plains for 9 long years. They had been changed by the war itself, shaped by forces that none of them fully understood. The conflict that had begun with gods and heroes was evolving into something that would require new words to describe, new stories to contain its meaning. The age of clear distinctions between divine and mortal, between civilization and chaos, between honor and survival was ending. What was being born in its place would reshape not just the outcome of this particular war, but the very nature of warfare itself. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang its ancient song of sorrow. Its voice, a fragile thread of beauty, in a world increasingly defined by its absence. Tomorrow would bring fresh heroes to the fore, new acts of courage and cruelty, and perhaps the beginning of the end for one side or the other. But tonight, in the brief space between one day's bloodshed and the next, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very elements sensed that something fundamental was shifting in the balance of the world. The Trojan War was no longer just a war. It was something else entirely, a transformation that would echo through the ages, changing not just how men fought, but how they understood the very nature of heroism, honor, and the price of glory. The old songs would soon be inadequate to capture what was emerging from the of the familiar world, and in his tent beside the black ships, Achilles polished his divine armor and dreamed of the death that awaited him, knowing that his choice had set in motion forces that would outlive them all. The year 1187 stands like a shadow across the landscape of medieval history. 3 decades have passed since the Second Crusade collapsed in humiliating failure before the walls of Damascus. The Crusader states that once seemed destined to expand across the entire Levant now cling precariously to a narrow strip of coastal territory. In Jerusalem, the leper king Baldwin Iverhas died, leaving behind a fractured succession and a kingdom torn by civil war. The unity that once made the Franks formidable has dissolved into bitter factionalism with the native-born nobility. The Pelasgians, at odds with newly arrived Europeans who understand neither the land nor its people. Into this vacuum steps a figure who will reshape the entire character of the Holy Wars. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Orb, known to history as Saladin, has spent the past decade methodically uniting the fractured Muslim world under his banner. Unlike his predecessors, who rallied through fear and divided their enemies through careful diplomacy, Saladin offers something far more dangerous. A vision of unified Islamic resistance, blessed by religious authority and backed by military genius. The Sultan's rise began not in the glittering courts of Baghdad or Cairo, but in the harsh Kurdish mountains of northern Mesopotamia. Born into a family of military administrators serving the Zengid dynasty, he learned statecraft in the shadow of his uncle, a general whose campaigns in Egypt would reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. When Shuru died suddenly in Cairo in 1169, the young Saladin found himself thrust into leadership of a foreign army in a hostile land, surrounded by enemies who viewed him as an upstart Kurdish adventurer with neither legitimacy nor prospects for survival. But Saladin possessed qualities that his contemporaries fatally underestimated. Where other military commanders relied on brutality to maintain control, he combined genuine piety with calculatedmacy, winning over populations that had suffered under harsh Fatimid rule. Where previous conquerors had been content to extract tribute and move on, he methodically built administrative systems that could transform military victory into lasting political control. Most crucially, where his rivals saw the Crusader states as obstacles to their regional ambitions, Saladin recognized them as a unifying force that could rally all Islam under a single banner. The conquest of Egypt provided him with resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary ruler. The Nile's annual flood generated agricultural wealth that could fund armies and build fortifications. The trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean brought customs revenues that filled treasury votes. The religious prestige of Cairo with its great mosque university, Al-Azhar offered a platform for presenting himself not merely as another warlord but as the champion of Orthodox Sunni Islam against both Shia heretics and Christian invaders. Yet even these advantages might have proved insufficient against the combined strength of the Crusader states and their Byzantine and Armenian allies. Had not the Franks themselves provided Saladin with the opportunity he needed. The death of Baldwin in 1185 triggered a succession crisis that revealed just how fragile the Latin kingdom had become. The crown passed to his nephew, the child Baldwin V, under the regency of Raymond of Tripoli, a statesman who understood that survival required accommodation with Muslim neighbors. But the boy king died after barely a year. The throne was seized by Guy of Flusina, whose wife Sibylla gave him a claim through marriage. but whose character inspired neither respect nor contempt. Guy's elevation split the kingdom between supporters of the established succession and nobles who backed the rival claim of Humphrey of Torun, husband of Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister. This division might have remained a manageable political dispute, but it became a military crisis when Reynold of Charton, Lord of Caddock, launched unauthorized raids against Muslim caravans crossing his territory. Reynold was precisely the kind of crusader that contemporary chroniclers loved to describe: brave to the point of recklessness, proud to the point of arrogance, and utterly indifferent to the political consequences of his actions. His attacks on Muslim merchants and pilgrims provided Saladin with the perfect justification for war. Islamic law demanded that rulers protect believers traveling under safe conduct, and Rield's violations of truces made him not merely an enemy, but an oath-breaker whose actions dishonored thievery concept of negotiated agreements when diplomatic protests failed to secure either compensation for losses or guarantees against future attacks. Saladin declared jihad against the Crusader states, calling upon all Muslims to unite in a holy war that would cleanse the land of infidel occupation. The army that assembled under his banners in 1187 represented the largest Muslim force ever gathered against the Crusader states. Contingents arrived from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Bayand, drawn by the promise of religious merit and material reward. But numbers alone had never been sufficient to defeat the Franks, whose heavy cavalry remained the most formidable military force in the medieval world. Saladin's genius lay in recognizing that victory required not just military superiority, but strategic insight that could turn the Crusader strengths into weaknesses. The campaign began with a calculated devotion. While the main Muslim army besieged Tiberias, the capital of Ramand of Tripoli's principality, Saladin detached a strong force to ravage the countryside around the city. The garrison commanded by Ramon's wife found itself cut off from relief, and facing inevitable starvation unless help arrived quickly. The situation created exactly the dilemma that Saladin had intended. The Crusader army must either march to relieve Tiberias, abandoning its defensive positions for a risky advance across hostile territory, or watch one of their major fortresses fall without offering resistance. King Guy summoned his vassals to muster at Sephiria, a strong position with reliable water supplies and good defensive terrain. Here, the Christian army could wait for Saladin to attack prepared positions, forcing the Muslims to assault uphill against heavy cavalry supported by infantry and crossbowmen. Raymond of Tripoli, despite his personal stake in Tiberias, argued passionately for remaining at Sephoria. He understood better than most how Muslim armies operated. Having spent years as Saladin's prisoner and learning to respect his captor's strategic acumen, "Tiberias is my city, and my wife is inside," he reportedly declared. But better that it should be lost than that should all be destroyed. But Guy faced pressures that made defensive strategy politically impossible. The military orders, whose Grand Masters commanded contingents of elite warrior monks, argued that abandoning Tiberias with a fight would appear cowardly and invite further Muslim aggression. Newly arrived crusaders from Europe, unfamiliar with local conditions but eager for glory, dismissed Ramon's warnings as the counsel of fear. Most persuasively, Gerard of Ried, Grand Master of the Templars, accused the king of cowardice and suggested Athos, who advocated defensive tactics, were secretly in league with the Muslims. The final decision came after a night of agonized deliberation. Guy, perhaps shopping to silence his critics through decisive action, perhaps genuinely believing that Christian valor could overcome any obstacle, ordered the army to march for Tiberias at dawn. The foresight departed Caesarea on July 3, 1187, represented virtually the entire military strength of the Crusader states. Perhaps 20,000 men, including 200 heavy cavalry, the core of Frankish military power. It was the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land, but it was also the last Armith kingdom could field. If this force were destroyed, no reserves remained to defend the cities and castles that constituted the Crusader presence in the Levant. The march began before sunrise, with advanced guards probing ahead for signs of Muslim forces. Initially, the route seemed clear, and some commanders began to hope that Saladin had withdrawn rather than risk battle against such a formidable host. But as the sun climbed a dagger and the July heat became oppressive, Muslim light cavalry began appearing on flanks, launching hit-and-run attacks that forced the Crusaders to maintain battle formation through Theothia advance. The constant harassment slowed progress to a crawl, while the weight of armor and weapons became increasingly burdensome under the merciless Middle Eastern sun. By midday, it had become clear that the army would not reach Tiberias before nightfall. Worse, the route passed through increasingly arid terrain where water sources were few and easily controlled by enemy forces. The springs at Tran, which should have provided relief for men and horses, had been poisoned or blocked by Muslims. As afternoon wore on, thirst began to take a greater toll than any morrows. Horses stumbled and collapsed, forcing knights to continue on foot. Infantry units began to lose cohesion as individual soldiers broke ranks to search for water. The decision to halt for the night near the village of Hayton sealed the army's fate. The position offered no water and little defensive advantage, but continuing the march in darkness would have invited complete disaster. As the Christians made camp on the barren plateau, Saladin's forces surrounded them completely, cutting off any possibility of retreat to Caesarea or advance to Tiberias. Throughout the night, Muslim engineers hauled up bundles of dry grass and thorn bushes, creating barriers that would channel any Christian breakout attempt into predetermined killing zones. Dawn on July 4th revealed the full extent of the trap. The Crusader army found itself surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces positioned on higher ground. Worse, the Muslims had set fire to the grass barriers during the night, and smoke from these fires, driven by wind toward the Christian positions, made breathing difficult and coordination nearly impossible. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical discomfort. The smoke seemed to symbolize the fires of hell, suggesting that God himself had abandoned the Christian cause. The battle that followed destroyed not merely an army, but an entire political system. The Crusader heavy cavalry, weakened, bithered, and blinded by smoke, could not execute the coordinated charges that had won so many previous victories. Individual acts of heroism providingless against the systematic destruction that Saladin inflicted. The infantry, abandoned big knights who could no longer protect them, broke and fled, only to be cut down by Muslim cavalry that had been positioned precisely to intercept such attempts. King Guy's desperate attempt to break through to the springs of Hattan failed when his exhausted horses could not maintain the charge necessary to pierce enemy lines. The royal standard was raised again, and fell one summer as the knights around it were systematically eliminated. By noon, organized resistance had collapsed entirely. The survivors found themselves prisoners of an enemy who had achieved victory through superior strategy rather than mere force of numbers. The capture of the True Cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusaderists' symbolized the completeness of the disaster. This fragment of wood, believed to be from the cross on which Christ was crucified, had accompanied Crusader armies into battle for nearly a century, serving as both spiritual inspiration and political symbol of Christian presence in the Holy Land. Its loss suggested that God had withdrawn his protection from the Frankish settlers, leaving them defenseless against righteous Muslim anger. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed the careful calculation behind his apparent magnanimity. Common soldiers and poor knights were sold into slavery, providing immediate profit and removing potential resistance fighters from circulation. Wealthy nobles were held for ransom, their freedom contingent on payments that would drain Crusader treasuries and prevent the financing of future military forts. The military orders whose members had taken vows that prevented them from being ransomed were executed en masse as dangerous enemies who could never be safely released. King Guy himself presented a special problem. Islamic law prohibited the execution of rulers who had been offered food and drink after capture, and Saladin carefully observed this prohibition by personally offering the king water. But Guy's continued existence as a legitimate Christian ruler could provide a rallying point for future resistance. So Saladin kept him in honorable captivity, while methodically destroying the kingdom he claimed to rule. The systematic reduction of Crusader fortifications began immediately after. Hattendat cities and castles that had seemed impregnable when defended by adequate garrisons found themselves untenable when no relief forces existed to break sieges. Acre, the kingdom's principal port, surrendered after a brief siege when its defenders realized that no help would come. Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon, and dozens of smaller strongholds followed suit, as Saladin's forces swept through territories that had been Christian for nearly a century. The psychological impact of these sojourners proved as important as their strategic value. Muslim populations that had lived under Crusader rule for generations rose in support of Saladin's forces. Provident intelligence about Christian defenses and ensuring that isolated garrisons faced hostile populations as well as besieging armies. Christian populations, particularly the indigenous communities that had predated the Crusades, found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties, but generally chose accommodation with the likely victor over futile resistance. Jerusalem itself, the symbolic heart of the Crusader enterprise, presented Saladin with his greatest opportunity for demonstrating the righteousness of his cause. The city that had been taken by the First Crusade through a massacre that shocked even medieval sensibilities would now be reclaimed through the mercy and justice that Islamic law demanded. The siege began in September 1187 with Saladin's forces positioned to prevent any relief from the few remaining Christian strongholds. The defense of Jerusalem was organized by Barelian of Abalon, one of the few great nobles to escape capture at. Barelian understood that military resistance was hopeless, but he also recognized that the manner of the city's surrender would determine the fate of its population. His negotiations with Saladin established terms that would become a model for the conquest of Christian territories: safe passage for those who could pay ransom, protection for religious sites and non-combatants, and guarantees against the kind of massacre that had accompanied the Crusader conquest. The peaceful surrender of Jerusalem on October 2, 1187, marked the effective end of the first phase of Crusader settlement in the Holy Land. The contrast with the bloody capture of 1099 was deliberate and pointed, where Christian conquerors had violated their own moral principles through indiscriminate slaughter. Muslim reconquest proceeded according to religious law and ethical standards that enhanced rather than diminished Saladin's reputation. the news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderbolt, shattering assumptions about the permanent nature of Crusader achievements and forcing a fundamental reassessment of Christian strategy in the East. The loss of the Holy Sepulchre, site of Christ's burial and resurrection, seemed to demand immediate and massive response. Yet the very scale of the disaster made effective response extraordinarily difficult. The infrastructure of the Crusader states had been so thoroughly destroyed that any new expedition would essentially have to conquer the Holy Land anew. Pope Gregory Visible, Edita Tremendi, issued in response to news of Hattin and Jerusalem fall called for a new crusade that would dwarf all previous expeditions. The spiritual rewards offered to participants exceeded even those promised by Urban II at Clermont. Complete remission of sins, protection of property during absence, and immunity from legal prosecution. But spiritual incentives, however generous, could not solve the practical problems that any new crusade would face. The political landscape of European 1187 seemed almost designed to frustrate crusading efforts. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed by conflicts between Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and his rebellious vassals. France and England remained locked in their ancestral rivalry, with Philip Augustus and Henry II more concerned about their mutual border than distant Jerusalem. The papacy itself was weakened by ongoing disputes with temporal rulers over investiture and taxation rights. Yet, gradually, the magnitude of the crisis forced European rulers to set aside their immediate concerns in favor of the larger Christian cause. Frederick Barbarossa, despite his advanced age, took the cross and began organizing what would become the largest German expedition ever sent to the Holy Land. Philip Augustus and Henry II, meeting at Guise in early 1188, agreed to suspend their conflicts and lead a joint Franco-English expedition. Most romantically, Henry's son Richard, heir to the English throne and Duke of Aquitaine, embraced the crusading ideal with an enthusiasm that would make him the Third Crusade, as this expedition came to be known, would be remembered as the most romantic and dramatic of all the holy wars. The personalities involved seemed drawn from the pages of epic literature. Richard the Lionheart, whose military genius and personal charisma made him the embodiment of knightly virtue. Philip Augustus, whose political cunning and administrative skill represented the new royal professionalism. Frederick Barbarossa, whose long career had made him the most respected ruler in Europe. And opposing them all, Saladin Himps, whose combination of military ability, political wisdom, and personal honor won the grudging respect even of his enemies. But romance should not obscure the fundamental challenges that faced the new crusade. The logistical problems of moving large armies across thousands of miles of hostile or neutral territory remained as daunting as ever. The financial costs of equipping and maintaining expeditionary forces for years of campaigning exceeded their sources of even the wealthiest kingdoms. Most critically, the strategic situation in the Holy Land had changed fundamentally since the First Crusade, where the original expeditions had faced a politically fragmented Muslim world. The Third Crusade confronted a unified Islamic empire under competent leadership. The German expedition, departing first in May 1189, initially seemed to vindicate optimistic predictions about crusading success. Frederick's army, numbering perhaps 15,000 men, represented the largest and best organized force the empire had ever sent eastward. The emperor's careful preparations, including detailed negotiations with Byzantine and Hungarian authorities for safe passage, suggested that the disasters which had befallen previous expeditions could be avoided through proper planning. The march through Hungary and the Balkans proceeded smoothly, with local populations friendly, cooperative, and supplies readily available through advanced arrangements. Even the traditionally difficult passage through Byzantine territory was accomplished without serious incident, though relations with Emperor Isaac Angelus remained tense throughout. Frederick's diplomatic skill, honed through decades of dealing with recalcitrant vassals and rival rulers, proved invaluable in navigating the complex political situations that arose at every border crossing. The entry into Asia Minor marked the beginning of serious military operations. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, while nominally subject to Saladin's authority, maintained effective endendin under Sultan Kayli Arland II. The Sultan's strategy was to avoid pitched battles while harassing the Crusader army through constant skirmishing, hoping to weaken the expedition through attrition rather than risk his forces in decisive engagements. That this approach initially proved effective. The German army, strung out along the narrow roads that crossed the Anatolian plateau, found itself under constant attack from Turkish horse archers who could strike quickly and withdraw before the heavy cavalry could respond. Water sources were poisoned or blocked, forcing long detours that exhausted men and animals. Supplies became increasingly difficult to obtain as local populations fled or were evacuated by Turkish authorities. The Battle of Iconium in May 1190 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the German expedition. Frederick's tactical skill enabled his forces to storm the Seljuk capital and scatter the Sultan's army, proving that Crusader military methods remained effective when properly applied. But the victory also revealed the costs of campaigning in hostile territory. The army had been reduced by perhaps a third through casualties, disease, and desertion, while the remaining force increasingly difficult to supply and control. It was in this context that on June 10, 1190, while crossing the Salif River in Sicily, Emperor Frederick drowned in circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Whether he suffered a heart attack while swimming, was swept away by the current while attempting to ford the stream, or met his end through some other misfortune, his death effectively ended the German crusade. The army, deprived of the leadership it had held it together through months of hardship, began to disintegrate almost immediately. Some contingents, led by Frederick's son, Duke Frederick of Swabia, continued toward the Holy Land and eventually reached Acre, where they joined the ongoing siege. But the great German expedition that had seemed capable of reconquering the entire Holy Land had been reduced to a few thousand servers, whose arrival barely affected the strategic balance. The death of Barbarossa demonstrated once again how dependent medieval expeditions were on individual leadership and how quickly the most carefully planned campaigns could collapse when key figures were removed. The Anglo-French expedition, departing in 1190, took a different route that avoided some of the hazards that had destroyed the German force. Philip Augustus and Richard sailed from their respective ports, planning to rendezvous in Sicily before continuing to the Holy Land. This maritime approach offered advantages in terms of speed and supply, but it also secreted new problems related to naval logistics and the politics of the Mediterranean powers. The winter spent in Sicily, 1191-1191, revealed both the potential for cooperation and the sources of tension that would eventually destroy the Anglo-French alliance. Richard's conquest of Spina, undertaken to protect Crusader supplies from local interference and entrance, his military capabilities, but also his tendency toward unilateral action that ignored the interests of allies. Philip's negotiations with Tancred of Sicily, aimed at securing naval support for the expedition, showed his diplomatic skill. but also his willingness to pursue French interests at the expense of common crusading goals. The personnel relationships between the two kings, complicated by feudal obligations that made Richard technically Philip's vassal for his French territories, grew increasingly strained as the expedition continued. Richard's marriage to Baron of Navarre, which took place in Cyprus during the voyage east, was seen by Philip as a deliberate slight to his sister Alice, who had been Richard's betrothed for many years. These personal grievances, while seemingly trivial compared to the great cause that had brought them together, would profoundly affect the conduct of military operations in the Holy Land. Richard's conquest of Cyprus in May 1191, accomplished during a brief stop to rescue ships wrecked in a storm, provided the crusade with an invaluable strategic base. The island's position off the Syrian coast made it an ideal staging area for operations against the mainland, while its agricultural resources could supply expeditionary forces for more immediately. The wealth seized from the Byzantine governor Isaac Comnenus helped fund the expensive siege operations that awaited the Crusaders at Acre. The siege of Acre, which had been ongoing since August 1189, had become the focal point of Christian efforts to regain the Holy Land. Guy of Lucan, released from captivity by Saladin in 1188, had established his claim to continued kingship by initiating this siege with the few forces he could muster. The arrival of European reinforcements had gradually transformed which began as a desperate gesture into a serious military operation. But the city's strong fortifications and Saladin's regular attempts to relieve the garrison had prevented any decisive progress. The siege had evolved into a double blockade, with the Crusaders surrounding Acre, while Saladin's forces the Crusaders. This complex situation created opportunities for neither side to achieve decisive victory through conventional means. The Christians could not take the city by storm, while the Muslims could not raise the siege without fighting through prepared positions that negated their advantages in mobility and archery. The result was a grinding war of attrition that consumed resources and lives while producing no clear strategic advantage for either side. The arrival of Philip Augustus in April 1191, followed by Richard in June, finally provided Thesage with the leadership and resources necessary for success. The two kings brought not only fresh troops, but also the latest developments in siege technology, manganese antibutes capable of battering down the strongest walls, engineers skilled in undermining fortifications, and the financial resources to sustain operations until victory was achieved. The final assault on Acre, launched in July 1191, succeeded through a combination of siege engines, mining operations, and direct assault that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond. The city's surrender in July 12 marked the first major Christian victory since Hatton and provided the crusade with a secure base for future operations. But the terms of surrender, which promised the lives of the garrison in exchange for the return of the true cross and the release of Christian prisoners, would soon become a source of controversy that revealed the growing divergence between Christian and Muslim concepts of honorable warfare. Saladin's inability to fulfill all the conditions of the surrender agreement, whether due to practical difficulties in locating the true cross or deliberate stalling, led to one of the most controversial episodes of the end. Richard's execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners in August 1191, carried out in full view of Saladin's army, shocked contemporary observers and has continued to generate debate among historians. The massacre demonstrated the Lionheart's ruthless pragmatism when military necessity conflicted with chivalric ideals. but it also eliminated any possibility of future renegotiations, and ensured that the war would continue with increased bitterness on both sides. The departure of Philip Augustus shortly after Acca's fall, ostensibly due to illness, but actually motivated by growing friction with Richard and concerns about French domestic affairs, left the English king as the dominant Christian leader in the Holy Land. This development suited Richard's temperament and ambitions perfectly. Heckle now conduct operations according to his own strategic vision without the need to accommodate allies whose objectives might differ from his own. The march south from Acre toward Jerusalem in August and September 1191 showcased Richard's tactical genius and his understanding of how to adapt traditional crusader methods to the realities of warfare against Saladin's, instead of the headlong charges that had characterized earlier expeditions. The English king developed a system of coordinated movement that protected his forces from the harassment tactics that had destroyed so many previous armies. The army advanced in carefully organized cavalry in the center, protected by infantry formations on their flanks. Crossbowmen provided covering fire against Muslim horse archers, while supply trains were positioned to minimize their vulnerability to raids. Most innovatively, Richard established a system of rotation that allowed tired units to be relieved without disrupting the overall formation, ensuring that his forces remained fresh and combat-ready throughout the long march. Saladin's response to this methodical advance revealed his own tactical sophistication and his deep understanding of Crusader psychology. Rather than attempting to prevent the Christian advance through pitched battle where Xud's heavy cavalry might prove decisive, the Sultan sought to provoke the kind of undisciplined charge that had led to disaster at Hatton. Muslim forces conducted constant harassment, appearing suddenly to launch attacks and withdrawing before effective rotation could be organized. The Battle of Arsu on September 7, 1191, represented the culmination of this strategic duel between two of the greatest military minds of the medieval period. Saladin, recognizing that the steady Christian advance could not be stopped through harassment alone, committed his entire army to a pitched battle designed to break Richard's formations through overwhelming pressure. The Muslim forces, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, launched coordinated attacks against the Crusader columns from multiple directions, seeking to force the premature cavalry charge that had destroyed so many previous Christian armies. Richard's response demonstrated why he was considered the finest military tactician of his generation. Despite enormous pressure from his knights, who chafed under the constant missile fire and demanded permission to charge, the English king maintained strict discipline within his formations. The Hospitallers, positioned in the rear guard and bearing the brunt of the Muslim assault, sent repeated messages begging for permission to attack. But Richard continued to wait for the perfect moment when a coordinated charge could achieve maximum effect. The breakthrough came when Saladin's forces, encouraged by their apparent success in pinning down the Christian army, pressed their attacks too closely and lost the mobility that was their primary advantage. At precisely the right moment, Richard unleashed his heavy cavalry in a coordinated charge that shattered the Muslim formations and sent them streaming back across the coastal plain. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since Hatton, a major Muslim army had been decisively defeated in open battle. Yet, while a tactical masterpiece failed to achieve the strategic breakthrough that Richard needed to justify his enormous expenditure of resources and lives, Saladin's army, though defeated, was not destroyed. Within days, Muslim forces were again harassing Christian positions and threatening supply lines. The Sultan had learned that he could not defeat Richard in open battle, but he had also demonstrated That military defeat did not necessarily translate into political collapse. When facing an enemy with secure bases and reliable support from the local population, the advance toward Jerusalem resumed after the victory at Arsuf soon revealed a fundamental dilemma that faced any Christian attempt to reconquer the Holy Land. The Crusader army could win battles and capture cities, but holding territory required resources and manpower that exceeded anything the European expeditions could provide. Each mile of advance stretched supply lines further and required additional troops for garrison duties, while Saladin's forces remained free to concentrate against whatever target offered the best opportunity for success. By January 1192, Richard's army had advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem, close enough that the towers and walls of the Holy City were visible from the Crusader camps. For many participants, this proximity to their ultimate goal seemed to justify all the hardships and casualties of the previous years. Jerusalem lay before them, apparently defensible only by the same Muslim forces they had already defeated yet Richard, with the cool calculation that marked all his military decisions, recognized that capturing the city would be easier than holding it. The logistical analysis was unforgiving. Jerusalem's position in the Judean hills made it difficult to supply from the coastal bases that provided the Crusade with reinforcements and equipment. The city's large Muslim and Jewish populations could not be relied upon for support and might actively assist any relief army. Most critically, Saladin retained control of Damascus, Cairo, and the other major Muslim centers, giving him unlimited opportunities to besiege a Christian garrison left in Jerusalem, while the main Crusader army returned to Europe. The decision to withdraw from the approaches to Jerusalem without attempting an assault represented one of the most controversial moments of Richard's entire career. Contemporaneous writing for audiences that had invested enormous resources in the Crusade struggled to explain how the greatest Christian warrior of the age could abandon the Holy City when it seemed within his grasp. Later historians have generally vindicated Richard's strategic judgment, but at the time the withdrawal appeared to many observers as an inexplicable failure of will at the crucial moment. The negotiations that followed this withdrawal revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval diplomacy. Richard and Saladin, despite their military rivalry, had developed a mutual respect based on their shared understanding of warfare and statecraft. Both recognized that the current situation was unsustainable. The Crusaders could not advance further without risking destruction, while the Muslims could not force a decisive battle without accepting potentially catastrophic losses. The personal diplomacy between the two leaders, conducted largely through Richard's negotiations with Saladin's brother al-Adil, explored possibilities that went far beyond simple military truths. Richard's proposal that his sister, Joanna, marry Al-Adil and rule Jerusalem jointly represented an extraordinarily creative attempt to resolve the fundamental religious conflict through dynastic alliance. Though ultimately rejected due to religious objections on both sides, the proposal demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that both leaders brought to their seemingly intractable conflict. The final phase of the Third Crusade, extending through 1192, consisted of a series of military operations that achieved as this epic journey through the Crusades ends. Centuries of conflict revealed to have transformed from religious pilgrimages into complex webs of politics, warfare, and cultural exchange that shaped both the Christian and Islamic worlds. The legacies of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin remind us that even amid great division, honor and respect can transcend religious boundaries. Although the Crusades failed in their original goal of permanent Christian control over the Holy Land, they forged lasting connections between East and West that influenced art, science, philosophy, and trade for generations. History's greatest lessons often emerge not from absolute victories or defeats, but from humanity's capacity to learn, adapt, and find meaning in time.